Hello fellow sapiens, a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking through tall grass beneath a night sky, resting beneath a low firelight, or simply listening as sleep begins to pull you under, this space is for you, because tonight we are returning to the oldest mystery written on our skin. This is calm storytelling for warm-blooded minds. It's one of the most overlooked paradoxes in prehistory. The story of how we, alone among the mammals, lost our fur not once, but twice. A tale that stretches across 2 million years of sun, salt, heat and wind. But it's not the simple story of survival or climate you may expect. It begins not with clothing or cold, but with sweat. And, if you're the kind of person who finds comfort in ancient puzzles, who enjoys wandering through long-form atmospheric science, just look right below the video. There's a small button there that says subscribe. You can tap it if you'd like. You can unsubscribe any time, and the bell icon next to it will gently let you know when a new story arrives. That small click helps keep this channel alive. Without it, I simply can't make more of these. I do wonder, where are you listening from, and what time is it, wherever you are? If you feel like sharing in the comments, it's a quiet reminder that we're all listening together. Oh, and if you drift off, that's perfectly okay. There are timestamps waiting for you below. Now, we begin with the silence of the canopy. Why did we lose our fur not once but twice? Why would evolution strip the body of its protective coat and leave the skin exposed, not in a single, linear act of change, but in a repeating rhythm across continents and climates, across hundreds of thousands of years? The mystery of our nakedness is older than memory, older than language, older than fire. It is a riddle hidden not in ice or desert, but in the humid breath of ancient forests, where the story begins not with loss, but with silence. And so, we return to the canopy world, to the Miocene epoch, 20 million years ago, when the ancestors of humankind were not walkers of plains, but dwellers of trees, their limbs fluent in the language of branches, their eyes adapted to dappled light. Here evolution moved slowly like sap. Here time did not sprint. It clung, hummed, and layered itself in green. What did it feel like to live in a world where every surface was alive, where sound was absorbed into leaf and bark, and where the air itself held the weight of stories not yet spoken? In that soft cathedral of forest, fur was a quiet truth. Not decoration, not shame, not vanity. It was survival. It was warmth in the cool shade of dawn, camouflage against the patterned chaos of jungle light, protection from claw, thorn, sting, and cold. It was identity woven into biology. In every mammal that moved through those trees, from tiny nocturnal gliders to lumbering forest elephants, fur was the uniform of the age. And yet, within this world of perfect adaptation, a question stirred, not spoken aloud, not even formed in thought, but shaped in posture, hinted in movement. Something began to shift. Some primates clung more often to the vertical trunks than the high canopy. Some paused, balancing not on all fours but upright, testing a new perspective. Some chose risk over safety, venturing into more open forest edges, feeding on the ground where sun struck harder and danger crept closer. Why? What stirs an animal to break from the pattern? Was it hunger? Was it drought? Was it chance? Or was it something quieter, a restlessness that cannot be measured, only traced? The forest was not infinite. Seasons, once mild, began to swing wider. Rain patterns fractured, the canopy thinned. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but enough. Enough to change the rhythm of a life. The safe vertical maze of vines and branches became an uncertain lattice. For those willing to move, to adapt, to look farther, a different world waited, not above, but beyond. And perhaps, in that faint shift, the roots of the mystery were laid. For to shed fur is not simply to lose. It is to wager that warmth can come from elsewhere, that protection might one day be made, not grown. What kind of mind risks exposure for a glimpse of something new? The silence of the canopy held no answer. Only the murmuring of leaves, the distant calls of hornbills, and the patient eyes of predators watching from below. For millions of years, the forest had provided everything: food, shelter, rhythm, and identity. It had shaped the bodies and instincts of its inhabitants with unbroken precision. The early apes were masterpieces of balance, wrapped in fur as fine as moss, their fingers sculpted by the need to cling, their shoulders built for arcs through green air. Life was dense, layered, predictable. Nothing about it asked for change, and yet, deep within that perfection, the machinery of evolution never stopped whispering, adapt or fade. The fur that covered those ancient forms was not just insulation, it was history itself. Each strand carried the memory of an age when heat came and went with the sun, when storms were short and nights were cool. The Miocene forests pulsed with warmth, but they were not yet the furnace of the savannah. In those humid worlds, fur was balance incarnate. It shielded against insects, regulated the small fluctuations of temperature, and broadcast scent and status through subtle oils and secret chemicals. To lose it would have been unthinkable, even fatal. The fur was armour, cloak, and language all at once. But slowly, imperceptibly, the environment began to breathe in new patterns. Rivers shifted their courses, forests thinned into mosaics of open woodland. Trees, once close enough for a leap, began to stand apart like islands in a shallow sea of grass. The canopy fractured, and with it, the certainty of the old world. Those who remained dependent on its cover found themselves trapped within shrinking pockets of shade, while others began to move across the sunlit ground between the trees. For the first time, survival required not only agility but endurance. Still, in this moment, in this ancient equilibrium between shadow and light, fur reigned supreme. It shimmered in dark blues and browns beneath the filtered glow of the leaves. It was the boundary between the animal and the air. Every living thing here had learned to blend with the dappled light, to vanish into its own reflection. The fur's pattern was not merely a colour but a code, an evolutionary cipher tuned to a world of motion and stillness. Imagine standing there, a hominid before the name existed, listening to the forest hum with the soft chatter of insects and the far-off rumble of thunder. Your fur clings damp with sweat you do not yet know the meaning of. Your eyes track movement below, flashes of open light where the forest breaks. And somewhere deep in your bones, a new rhythm forms, faint and insistent, like a drumbeat beneath the soil. It is the sound of transition, the sound of curiosity, rising quietly against the endless chorus of green. And what, after all, is curiosity if not an early form of defiance, a refusal to be only what the world has made you, a gentle urge to look beyond the known? In the soft ancestral minds of early apes, curiosity did not yet carry the name we give it. It was not wonder or question or ambition. It was motion. It was a pause longer than usual, a step farther than safe, a hand reaching toward the ground not just to gather but to feel. The beginning of the human story was not a grand gesture. It was a hesitation, a lingering, a gaze held just a moment too long. And this mattered. In a world as finely tuned as the Miocene forest, even the smallest change in behaviour could echo across generations. A shift in diet, fruit one day, tuber the next. A change in posture, a longer moment on 2 feet before returning to all fours. A preference for the forest edge, where grasses whispered and light was cruel. In these quiet decisions the body followed. Muscles rebalanced, pelvises reshaped. To stand up was not a declaration. It was a compromise, made again and again by those who found benefit in risk. But risk brought exposure. The open spaces between trees were not only hotter, they were dangerous. There was less cover, less escape. The vertical posture that gave better sight also made one more visible, and fur, once perfect for blending into shade, became a liability beneath the sun. The dense insulation that protected against the chill of the forest became a trap for heat under the naked glare of the equatorial sky. The open ground required something new, something radical. Yet at this stage in the story no fur had been lost. Not truly, not yet. The creatures moving along the forest's edge still bore the legacy of their arboreal lives. Their skin was hidden, their bodies shaded by their own evolution, but somewhere deep in the scrolls of DNA, a slow unwinding had begun. The genes that governed follicle density began to shift. The glands that cooled the body grew more numerous. A new relationship was forming, not with fur but with sweat. What does it mean, evolutionarily, to begin adapting to a world you have only barely touched? To respond to heat that still lies mostly ahead? To prepare a body for a challenge that has not fully arrived? Perhaps that is the true beginning of what it means to be human, this strange foresight woven into flesh, this readiness for a path not yet walked. Even now, the majority of mammals hold their secrets within their coats. They hide their heat, their fear, their scent. But in this moment of deep time, one lineage began, slowly, tentatively, to let the body speak, to let skin become a surface of exchange, a canvas of adaptation. The silence of the canopy no longer felt whole. Something in it had cracked, not broken, not yet, but strained, like the first shift of tectonic plates beneath an ocean. The forest still towered, still dripped with vines and fog, still held its long breath between storms. But the rhythm of life had altered its tempo. Insects sang differently. Birds adapted their calls to longer distances. Even the wind moved with a new impatience, carrying the scent of grass from far beyond the trees. The forest, that once infinite world, had begun to feel like a border. And for the first time, a creature that would one day become human began to stand at that border and look outward. The body they carried was still dressed in the legacy of the forest, dense fur that shimmered when wet, keeping parasites from the skin and concealing the fragile pulse beneath. Every strand spoke of millennia of safety and shadow. Fur made sense here. It was the quiet, perfect answer to the forest's demands. Camouflage, insulation, touch. It softened contact with the rough bark of trees and held scent for social recognition. Through fur, the early apes belonged to their environment. Through fur, they vanished into it. Yet the same fur that was once language became silence. Beneath the sun, it grew heavy, trapping heat against skin that now began to flush and sweat. Beneath the forest edge, where the light pooled thick and unrelenting, that beautiful coat became a reminder of a world that no longer fully fit its wearer. Evolution rarely shouts. It whispers, it hesitates, it contradicts itself. Change comes not as revolution but as discomfort, a sense that the familiar is beginning to resist you. Imagine this moment not as a single scene, but as a million small acts repeated across time. One generation spends slightly longer foraging in the open, and the next finds itself better able to cool its body. A drought thins the trees. Those with less fur lose less water to sweat, move farther, survive longer. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the silent arithmetic of adaptation rewrites the rules of flesh. But all of this began here, in the stillness of the canopy, when fur still ruled, and the mind had not yet learned to dream of distance. The fur was not yet an obstacle. It was still the evidence of success, of mastery, of balance. It shimmered in the wet light, breathing with each movement. Beneath it, the skin was pale, tender, unseen. The creature itself never wondered what lay below. What must it have felt like to be wrapped in that inherited comfort, and yet to sense, dimly, that it could not last, that the air itself was changing, that the leaves whispered a new rhythm in their rustling. To lose fur is to step into vulnerability, but perhaps the first step toward that loss was not physical at all. Perhaps it was a change in awareness, a growing curiosity, a willingness to step into light, to feel the sun directly against the body, to learn what warmth and pain truly mean when they are no longer filtered through protection. Somewhere between the branches and the ground, between instinct and awakening, that awareness began to bloom. It bloomed not as an epiphany, but as a series of subtle recalibrations, a turning of the head, a lengthening of the spine, a moment of pause beneath the trees before crossing into the sun. A threshold was being approached slowly, gently, without ceremony. The body remained furred, yes, but the journey had begun. Not away from the forest, but toward a new relationship with the world. one in which the body would not only be protected by nature, but shaped by its trials, its heat, its vast and unsheltered openness. The forest, for all its complexity, was a closed system. It operated on ancient contracts, predator and prey, shelter and exposure, night and day, all negotiated under the green canopy. But the moment a creature stepped into the open, those contracts began to dissolve. The shadows no longer reached far enough to conceal. The air no longer held the same softness, and in that brutal clarity of light, the old strategies faltered. Fur could not hide you. Fur could not cool you. Fur, for all its history, began to betray you. And yet there was also promise here. To move through the heat was to gain freedom. To shed fur, eventually, was to inherit a new kind of resilience, one not written in hair but in endurance, in sweat, in breath. But all of that came later. For now, in this deep chapter of prehistory, all we see is the beginning. The moment where the silence of the canopy becomes not a comfort, but a question. And it is in that question that humanity is born, not yet in form, not yet in name, but in the choice to step beyond. Not because the forest had vanished, not because fur had failed, but because something in the body, something in the blood had started to listen to a new rhythm. What happens when the environment stops answering our needs and begins to demand something more? What happens when the skin beneath the fur begins to matter? This was not the first transformation, nor would it be the last. The story of the human body is a story of becoming, again and again, something slightly new. Of losing what was once vital in order to make space for what will be necessary. Fur was never just warmth. It was identity. And to lose it, even slowly, was to begin the journey towards something else entirely. The nakedness that would one day hold fire, hold tools, hold memory. But before all of that, there was only this. An animal, furred and half aware, pausing at the edge of a clearing. The sun above, the forest behind, the skin beneath hidden still. Waiting, listening. And in the great stillness of that moment, the silence of the canopy gave way to a new sound. Faint, uncertain, but unmistakable. The future, breathing through sweat. And then, the green begins to thin. Not with violence, not with flame, but with absence. With time, with drought, with the slow retreat of moisture from the sky. What was once endless forest begins to pull back like a tide, unravelling itself from the landscape. Canopy gives way to scattered woodland, woodland to pockets of brush, and finally to something unfamiliar. Grass. Not the soft, domesticated lawns of our world, but wild, waist-high oceans of golden blades, stretching into horizons unbroken by trees. The earth had begun to change its face. This is not merely a shift in scenery. It is a deep transformation, tectonic in silence. As tectonic plates rearranged continents and climates, rainfall patterns changed. Mountains rose and reoriented the wind. Temperatures fluctuated. Africa's dense forests, once reigning unchallenged, began to surrender their dominance. In their place, savannas, open, sunlit, and merciless. And with their emergence, the rules of life changed. The air itself shimmered with different meaning. Heat pooled in new ways. Shelter became a thing sought, not guaranteed. What must it have felt like for a forest-born creature to stand at the edge of this new world? To look across a grassland where the sky was no longer framed by branches, but by sheer emptiness. For millions of years, the forest had sculpted life into vertical elegance. Creatures climbed, hung, leapt. Their lives were private, shaded, intimate, but the savannah did not care for intimacy. It exposed, it punished. It rewarded only those who could move, see, sweat, and endure. And so, the Great Migration began, not across geography, but across form. From shade-dwellers to edge-walkers, from crouched climbers to upright striders, from the green hush of branches to the golden roar of heat and distance. This was not yet humanity, but it was the beginning of its necessity. Those who could tolerate the light survived. Those who dared to forage just a little farther into the open found new foods. Roots, seeds, marrow left behind by predators. But that openness came at a cost. To reach it, the body had to change. The eyes needed to see farther, the hands needed to carry, the spine needed to rise, and so it did. Bipedalism was not a plan. It was a series of experiments played out over generations. Slight tilts in the pelvis, new angles in the femur, changes in the arch of the foot. Each step upright was an echo of all the ones before it. Each moment spent gazing over the grass was an act of evolutionary wager. But it was courage, not convenience, that drove this shift. Courage in the face of visibility, courage to move without cover, to be seen fully by the sky and by every predator beneath it. Because what happens when the trees can no longer protect you? What is lost, and what might be gained, when you step into the open, exposed? The great shedding would not begin with the body. It would begin with the choice to rise, and that rise, though slow and uneven, was irreversible. Once the first step had been taken into the open, the forest could never feel the same. Its cool shadows, once sacred and all-encompassing, became constricting, its safety tinged with limitation. For those who had dared the savannah, who had felt the wind move uninterrupted across their skin and seen the sky stretch without end, there was no returning entirely to the old world. The air out here carried danger, yes, but also information. Scent travelled farther. Footsteps left marks in dry earth. And the light, unforgiving as it was, revealed the world in a way the forest never could. It is easy, from the comfort of hindsight, to imagine upright walking as destiny. But there is no such thing in evolution. There is only tension between what has worked and what might work better, between the safety of what is known and the promise of something more. Every early hominin that pushed forward on 2 feet was gambling. Bipedalism offered reach, endurance, vision, but it also stripped away speed, climbing agility, and a body plan perfected over tens of millions of years. And still, it happened. What kind of world would require such a gamble? A world in flux, a climate not just warming or cooling, but oscillating. Wet seasons stretched thinner. Droughts arrived harder. Vegetation patterns shifted in strange, sudden ways. For a creature who lived by foraging, who depended on memory, mobility, and timing, change like this meant death, unless it could be outrun, outthought, or outlasted. And the forest no longer offered enough ground to retreat. The open spaces held the future, if you could survive them. Bipedalism, then, was not a choice in the way we think of choices. It was a survival equation. Fewer trees meant more walking. More walking meant a new relationship with heat. To walk on 4 legs under direct sun was to overheat quickly. But to rise up reduced the surface area exposed to the sun and allow the wind to pass across the body. That changed everything. The first hominins to walk this way didn't just see farther. They stayed cooler. They stayed alive. But the sun is not gentle. It is not merciful. As the forests fell back and the grasslands expanded, the sky became a constant companion and a constant judge. There was no hiding from its gaze. Fur, once a blessing, began to trap heat. The very feature that once protected now punished. And so, invisibly, subtly, the first pressures on the skin began. Not to reveal it yet, but to prepare it. Sweat glands became more active. Heat dissipation became a matter of survival. And still the fur remained. Because the body does not leap. It hesitates, it adjusts, it listens. And in that listening, it begins to rewrite itself. Not out of desire, but out of necessity. What does it mean when your very shape is determined by how far you must walk to survive? It means that evolution begins to wear a path into your body. Not just in the way you move, but in the way you breathe, sweat, balance, and bear your own weight beneath the punishing light. It means that every step becomes both a test and a teacher. With each stride across the tall grass, muscles realign, tendons stretch longer. The foot becomes less of a grasping limb and more of a spring-loaded platform. The hands, now unburdened by locomotion, are free to carry, to cradle, to strike, to shape. But for all this ingenuity, the open plains offered no mercy. To stand in the grass was to be visible to every eye. Eyes with fangs, with claws, with speed no hominin could outrun. The savannah was a theatre of predators, and to move upright through it was to enter the spotlight. Yet somehow in this exposure our ancestors found an edge. They began to see before they were seen. Their vision lifted above the grass, scanning for movement, reading the wind. To survive here was not to hide, but to anticipate, and anticipation required a mind that could imagine danger before it arrived, a brain that could project, remember, and adjust. And so, over hundreds of thousands of years, neural complexity grew in tandem with posture. Bipedalism may have changed the body, but it also changed the brain. Walking upright required planning. Planning required memory. And memory opened the door to everything that followed. Still, each new gain carried with it a cost, no longer supported by tree limbs and swaying vines. The upright form became biomechanically unstable. Bipedalism narrowed the birth canal. It required a longer dependency period for the young, who now had to be born earlier, more helpless, more dependent. The trade-offs were real, a cascade of vulnerability for a future not yet guaranteed. But somehow, it worked. The savannah demanded collaboration. Danger could not be outrun, but it could be outweighted. Prey that bolted in panic could be tracked for hours, until the heat broke their stamina. Groups that moved together fared better. Eyes could be shared. Warning calls passed. The strength of the individual bent to the strength of the group, and with every mile walked, with every minute survived under the sun, the fur, that relic of the forest, became less essential, not yet gone, but no longer absolute. Slowly, the skin beneath began to matter, and beneath that skin new pathways of cooling emerged, sweat pouring not just from the armpits or groin, but from nearly every surface of the body. The great shedding still waited in the future, but the blueprint had been drawn. It was not just a change in appearance, it was a change in logic. To move through the sun, one had to surrender to it, to let the heat pass through you, not be trapped against you. What kind of creature accepts vulnerability in order to endure? Perhaps only one that has already begun to understand that survival is not always strength, but strategy. That sometimes the safest path is not to resist the environment, but to let it reshape you. The apes that once ruled the canopy had skin hidden in shadow, wrapped in warmth and invisibility. But here, on the open grasslands, that skin began its long exposure. It began to feel. It began to breathe. And with that breath came change. The grasslands did more than stretch space. They stretched time. To chase prey across such distances required not just speed, but endurance measured in hours. It demanded pacing, self-regulation, and above all, cooling. Where predators relied on bursts of power, these early hominins relied on patience. Where the body heated, it had to shed that heat or collapse. And so sweating emerged, not as an inconvenience, but as a gift. The salt left behind marked every trail, every exertion, every lesson learned in sun-soaked pursuit. But the fur, that glorious forest inheritance, was not yet ready to leave. It clung, it resisted, it shaded, yes, but also suffocated. And so the balance shifted slowly. Hair density thinned across the body. Not all at once, and not in all regions. The head retained its covering, shielding the brain from direct sun. Other regions, the groin, the armpits, remained dense, protecting lymph and scent. But the limbs, the back, the chest, they began to whisper of something new. It was not loss, it was exchange. An exchange between concealment and expression, between barrier and communication. For once the fur began to fade, the skin could speak in other ways. It could flush with blood to signal stress or anger. It could glisten with sweat to cool or reflect. It could tan or burn, changing tone in relation to the sun. It became an interface, not just a surface, a boundary that reacted, adapted, learned. And in this transformation, something profound unfolded. The very act of being visible became part of survival. The early upright apes were no longer just bodies moving through space. They were signals, shadows, silhouettes cast long across the plain. Their skin marked them. Their movement revealed them. There was no more hiding, only navigating exposure with grace. And in that graceful navigation, identity began to emerge. To walk into the sun required not just physiology, but intention, a body aware of itself, a mind beginning to tie action with outcome. These early hominins may not have known why they stood or sweated or endured, but each generation inherited what worked, and slowly the lineage began to reflect the landscape it traversed. Where trees once provided refuge, now distance became defence. Where shadow once concealed, now the horizon offered opportunity. The tension between safety and possibility was no longer theoretical. It was written in every joint, every breath, every burned patch of skin. And in that tension, the story of human becoming took root. How many generations must pass before a body begins to dream of the world that is reshaping it? Perhaps only as many as are needed for a body to forget the forest, not in memory, but in movement. For the forest does not vanish all at once. It lingers at the edges of awareness, in the curve of the foot, in the grasping reflex of the hand, in the fear that rises at the sound of breaking branches. But the grasslands are patient teachers. They do not erase, they overwrite. They replace tree with sky, canopy with wind, verticality with depth, and as they do, they shape the creatures that move through them into something else, something more exposed but also more enduring. In this crucible of sunlight and dust, a new kind of intelligence emerges, not born of abstraction or language yet, but of anticipation. To survive the savannah is to plan, to map the world not in branches and nests, but in trails, watering holes, and shadows that move across the ground. And to do this well, one must move upright, see farther, travel longer. One must accept the sun not as an enemy, but as a condition of life, and the body follows. It leans forward, it aligns, it stretches the spine and narrows the hips. It builds arches into the foot and rhythm into the gait. Each adaptation is a conversation with heat, distance, and time, and slowly, generation after generation, fur loses its argument. Not everywhere. Not entirely, but its reign is broken. The skin begins to speak louder than the coat, and in that shift the possibility of a new kind of body, a new kind of being, emerges. But this is not just the story of physical form, it is the story of courage, because to walk upright into the savannah is to risk everything. It is to become visible, vulnerable and alone beneath the vast blue weight of the sky. It is to carry your past in your spine and your future in your sweat. The shedding that begins here is not a shedding of fur alone. It is a shedding of certainty, of protection, of all that once allowed you to blend in. The great shedding begins not in the follicles, but in the steps. And even now, beneath your skin, you carry its echo. Every drop of sweat, every long walk, every burn and every breeze reminds you, you are the child of the grasslands. You are the product of exposure. You were not made for hiding. So what happens next, when the body that once belonged to shadow finally learns to belong to the sun? The grass awakens beneath the feet of your ancestors. It parts for their passage, whispers in their wake, and in that whisper is the first utterance of a question that will echo for the rest of our story. What will you become when the world dares you to be seen? The question echoed across the rising plain, where shade vanished and distance reigned. The trees, once clustered like sentinels of certainty, now stood scattered and skeletal against a sky that no longer softened its gaze. In their absence, the horizon burned, not with fire, but with light, with heat, with the slow and relentless weight of the sun. Where once the forest had offered intimacy and hush, the savannah offered only exposure. And in this open crucible, the sun became something new. No longer a cycle of warmth and coolness, it was now a constant force, a ceiling that bore down, a pressure that sculpted bodies not for rest but for motion. Fur, that ancient garment of the mammal, now betrayed its bearer. It caught the heat, trapped it close, refused to release it. What once defended now overwhelmed. Beneath that dense coat the body sweltered. Muscles laboured. The core simmered. To move under the burning sky was to fight a fire from within, and unlike wind or predator, this adversary was invisible, unceasing, and everywhere. Death by heatstroke came not in an instant, but in a steady unravelling, a failure of balance, of breath, of blood. How does a body learn to survive when the very air conspires to cook it alive? It learns to cool itself. It finds new ways to shed the heat that the sky insists upon. And so, buried deep within the skin, evolution begins a new draft of the body. It opens pores wider. It amplifies glands, not just the oily apocrine glands found in most mammals, but the watery eccrine glands that spill salt and liquid across the surface of the skin. These become the lifelines. These become the defense. For each drop of sweat is a tiny sacrifice, a loss of water to gain survival. With each shimmering coat of moisture, the skin becomes its own climate system, evaporating, adjusting, enduring. But to sweat is only half the answer. The other half is exposure. For sweat to cool, it must leave. And for it to leave, fur must give way. Slowly, patch by patch, region by region, the fur thins. It does not disappear overnight. There is no single ancestor who woke naked. But there is a lineage in which less becomes more. Less fur, more cooling, less shade, more distance. And with that trade comes transformation. A creature no longer adapted to hiding in foliage, but to crossing open land. A creature built not for sprinting, but for duration, for waiting, for walking. The heat, then, was not only a burden, it was a sculptor. It shaped bodies that could lose heat faster than they generated it. Bodies that could move for hours, long after other predators had tired and turned back. And in doing so, the sun gave rise to a new kind of endurance. When the horizon burns, who survives, the fast or the steady? In the slow arms race between predator and prey, the answer had always favoured the swift, the agile, the explosive. But now, on these vast sun-drenched plains, time itself became a weapon. The predators with sharp fangs and short bursts of fury faltered under the prolonged heat. They panted, they shaded, they slept through the hottest hours. But something else, something quieter, kept walking. Walking not to chase but to follow. Not to kill with force, but to wear the prey down by outlasting it. This new rhythm belonged not to the sprint, but to the slow pursuit. The hunt, reimagined as an act of patience. And to hunt with patience, the body had to endure heat not as an enemy, but as a partner. The skin, once buried beneath layers of fur, had to become the site of adaptation. Every step taken in the sun meant more heat absorbed. Every muscle movement added to the internal fire. So the body became a furnace with a vent. That vent, the skin surface, had to remain clear, exposed and soaked in sweat. The eccrine glands, once sparse, multiplied across the body like stars. Nowhere else in the animal kingdom was there such a concentration, such an ambitious reimagining of thermoregulation. And as the sweat ran, it cooled. But it also left behind something more permanent, a new kind of biological architecture. To support such a system, blood vessels grew denser near the skin. Salt and water balance became a daily negotiation, etched into the kidneys, the hormones, the rituals of life. Shade-seeking, water-finding, breath-pacing. These became instinctive rhythms, passed on like inheritance. And though the fur still lingered, it no longer defined, because something else was taking shape. Somewhere around 1.5 million years ago, the fossil record begins to change. A new figure rises from the earth, taller, longer-limbed, with narrow hips and broad stride. The skull smaller in face, but larger in brain. The teeth less suited for crushing foliage, more refined for precision. This is not an ape that walks. This is a walker that thinks. Homo erectus, the upright man, the long-distance survivor. What makes Homo erectus so extraordinary is not just its anatomy, but what that anatomy suggests. Range, movement, endurance. These beings did not merely adapt to the savannah, they inhabited it. They ranged far beyond the forests of their birth, appearing from Africa to Southeast Asia, crossing arid zones and varied ecosystems with a grace no other primate had ever achieved. This was not wandering, this was expansion, deliberate and sustained. And what body carried them forward across such distances? A body built by fire, not the kind they would one day hold in their hands, but the fire of the sun, the fire inside, the fire that demanded a vessel cool enough to keep walking. To move like this was not simply to survive, it was to declare through motion alone that life could be won through heat, not in spite of it. The savannah had become a proving ground, a vast arena of shimmering distance and shimmering bodies, where survival no longer belonged to those who hid, but to those who endured. Each horizon was a test, each day a negotiation between thirst and distance. The sun became the great equalizer. Every creature bent beneath it, but only one lineage learned to walk through it unbroken. Where others fled to the shade, Homo erectus moved forward. Shoulders rolling in rhythm, lungs deep and steady, skin glistening with the slow poetry of adaptation. This mastery of heat was not only physical, it was behavioural. The landscape taught strategy. The air itself dictated the rhythm of existence. To chase an antelope was not to match its speed, but to mirror its exhaustion. Over hours, sometimes over an entire day, a group of hunters would follow, tracking the shimmer of a movement, the trail of footprints in dust, the pattern of breath in the wind. The antelope would sprint and rest, its body built for bursts, not for distance. But Homo erectus would not stop. Its cooling system allowed the muscles to keep working long after others overheated. In time, the prey's body betrayed it. The lungs collapsed under heat stress. The heart failed. The hunters, walking still, arrived to claim what endurance had earned. How strange that our lineage, the one that shed its fur, that dared the open plain, won its place in the world not through power, but persistence. Inside that long walk, the brain found something new to do with its time. With endurance came patience, and with patience came thought. The rhythm of the hunt mirrored the rhythm of attention. One had to notice patterns, read the landscape, remember routes. Each drop of sweat was paired with a drop of awareness. The two evolved together, inseparable. To cool the body was to buy time for the mind, and beneath the skin, the story continued. The density of sweat glands, millions across the surface, became the signature of the human form. Nowhere else in the animal kingdom did such a system exist. Each gland was a declaration of independence from the forest past. The fur that once defined the mammal was now redundant, its function replaced by water and salt, by evaporation and wind. The very act of walking under the sun became a process of alchemy. Heat in, salt out, energy turned into endurance. What began as survival in heat was becoming adaptation through design. The body was being re-engineered by nature's harshest engineer, climate. The long limbs, the upright frame, the darkening of the skin, the widening of the nostrils, the cooling of the brain case. Each change was a piece of the same silent architecture. The earth burned, and we adjusted. And in this furnace of transformation, humanity's first outline began to emerge, not as an idea but as a shape walking into the light. A silhouette on the savannah, muscles taut, skin wet with exertion, the body in constant negotiation with the heat pressing down from above and rising from the baked earth below. No longer shielded by fur, the human form stood bare, but not defenceless. In place of a thick coat, it wore adaptation. The skin darkened with melanin, absorbing sunlight while protecting against its damage. The limbs elongated to disperse heat more efficiently. The feet broadened and arched, able to carry this upright traveller across the harshest terrains. This was not the fragility of exposure. This was the elegance of survival reimagined. And Homo erectus moved forward, not as a wanderer lost in an unfamiliar world, but as a creature increasingly sculpted by its demands. The body's heat management system, a marvel of biological compromise, was only possible because of the loss of fur. But that loss had to be gradual, careful. For every square centimetre of exposed skin, a new burden emerged. Water loss. Sweating cooled, but it also dehydrated. Salt became precious. Rivers, springs, shaded groves, these became not luxuries, but lifelines. So the mind followed the body, mapping sources, memorizing terrain, predicting weather. The first navigational awareness took root not in exploration for its own sake, but in pursuit of balance, not too far without water, not too long without rest, but always onward, always forward, the body adjusting its pace to the shifting heat of the day, its stride to the demands of terrain, its skin radiating warmth like an open system, always shedding, always breathing. Fur could not have done this. To retain a thick coat in this world was to overheat, to collapse, to die. Other mammals adapted with different tricks: panting, nocturnality, hiding. But humans, or the ancestors we now begin to call human, chose a different path. They met the sun head-on. The change did not come because fur was suddenly useless, but because something more powerful emerged to replace it: the ability to regulate heat through a dynamic, responsive skin. A skin that now acted as a boundary and a bridge, letting go of heat, holding on to life. It's here, on this burning plain, that the idea of human resilience finds its root, not in strength alone, not in weaponry or tools, or even language. Those would come later. What came first was the ability to keep going when the world tried to make you stop, the ability to move when the ground burned your soles, when the air parched your throat, when the sun aimed its full force directly at your spine. Endurance was not just a means of survival. It was the strategy, the plan. And endurance, as it turns out, left fingerprints everywhere. Fossils of long legs, narrow pelvises, ashen trails etched into ancient ground, bones of prey with signs of slow pursuit, campsites far from forest edge, and skin, though it never fossilized, made itself known in the systems that depended on it, in sweat glands, in kidneys, in salt cravings, in the rituals of water and rest that would follow us all the way into the modern age. The legacy of this transformation lies not just in bones or tools, but in the way our biology continues to whisper of its origins. Every drop of sweat on a summer run, every instinct to seek shade, to sip slowly, to rest in the hottest hours. These are not modern habits. They are echoes of a million-year-old dialogue between skin and sun. By the time Homo erectus had spread across continents, the shedding of fur was no longer a future adaptation, it was the past. The naked skin we wear today, inherited and refined, was already in motion then, transforming our species into the most efficient thermoregulators on land. This loss was not a subtraction, but a reshaping. Fur had protected us in the forests. Its absence now allowed us to survive in the open. It was not a failure of nature, it was her recalibration. Still, the cost was high. Water had to be found more often, skin became vulnerable to cuts, burns, parasites. And exposure brought new challenges: freezing nights, biting insects, glaring heat. But evolution is not perfection. It is compromise, a series of trade-offs that favour survival just enough to carry life forward. And in these trade-offs, something deeper began to emerge. Not only did the shedding of fur grant us the ability to cool, to move, to outlast, it also granted us an intimacy with the environment that no other mammal possessed. To wear our skin bare was to feel the wind directly, to sense the brush of grass, the sting of ash, the warmth of another's touch. Where fur once insulated, now we connected. We became sensitive to the world in a literal sense. The body became not just a vessel, but a sensory field. And in that awareness, perhaps, was the first flicker of something else: consciousness. To feel heat is not just to detect it. It is to know discomfort. To crave shade is not just instinct. It is the beginning of choice. And choices require minds capable of weighing, predicting, remembering. As the skin thinned, perhaps the mind thickened. Perhaps the burning horizon lit not just the land, but the interior of our thinking. In the cooling sweat, in the open steppe, in the long gaze toward water, a new kind of human began to emerge. And what remained behind was the memory of fur, tucked deep in the genome, in the fine hairs that still rise with goose flesh, in the patterns of body hair that never quite vanished. A quiet reminder that we were once cloaked in a different world, one ruled by branches and shade, not light and dust. But there, beneath the vast sky, with sweat drying in the wind and the road unrolling ahead, we became something else. Not fully human, not yet, but no longer what we were. We became the ones who could bear the heat. We became the ones who could keep walking. At some point in the immense, unrecorded span of deep time, somewhere between the hush of the Miocene canopy and the fire-stretched glare of the Pleistocene plain, fur gave way to skin, not all at once, not as a dramatic molting, but slowly, invisibly, over generations too many to name. The cloak that had cradled our ancestors for tens of millions of years began to thin. A veil was being lifted, and underneath it something new emerged, a body no longer wrapped in warmth, but in vulnerability and intention. The sweating ape was coming into being. But how do we trace a loss that left no fossil behind? How do we map an absence? The answer lies not in what fur left, but in what it required. Hair follicles fossilise poorly, but the genes that manage them echo through our cells like soft background music from an earlier composition. Across our bodies the code remains, dormant in some places, active in others. The human form, so seemingly naked, still grows fine hair across its limbs, its face, its back. But those hairs are relics, stunted reminders of what once was. The master switch that had once commanded thick pelts now only whispers. And where that silence deepens, science listens. The genetic evidence reveals a suite of changes, mutations in key genes responsible for follicle size and density, the presence of specific proteins that favour finer, shorter hair, and the unusual expression of keratin genes that are no longer needed for heavy insulation. The clues are layered, scattered, often hidden in comparative genetics. Why does our closest cousin, the chimpanzee, bear a denser coat? Why do we share certain mutations with aquatic mammals, desert dwellers, runners? The emerging consensus is a compelling one. Fur vanished because it had to. Because the open plains demanded more than protection, they demanded regulation. Fur traps heat. Even the thinnest coat becomes a liability when the air does not cool, when the wind is still, when the ground radiates heat upward like a furnace. And unlike most mammals whose cooling systems rely on panting or shade, humans began to rely on something subtler, something more direct, the wet gleam of sweat on bare skin. Why sweat? Why skin? Because sweat is liquid strategy. It is evaporation turned into escape. Each droplet drawn from within lifts heat from the core of the body as it vanishes into the dry air. No panting mammal can match it. No fur-covered predator can cool so precisely, but for sweat to work, the skin must be exposed, air must move across it. Fur interferes, fur suffocates, and so fur disappeared. Evolution didn't strip it away in a fit of inspiration. It peeled it back slowly as the sun grew hotter, the days grew longer, the hunts stretched farther. Bit by bit, skin emerged into the light, not as weakness, but as technology, a living surface, engineered to breathe. What must it have felt like, that first exposure, that first ripple of wind across naked shoulders, that first burn, that first sting? What must it have meant to be unclothed in a world not yet shaped for skin? There was no celebration, no dawning realization that something monumental had occurred. The transition was quiet, as evolution often is, invisible to those living through it. But the consequences over time were profound. To lose fur was not simply to alter appearance, it was to redefine the interface between the body and the world. The skin became a canvas, a boundary, a surface of adaptation, and in shedding fur, early humans made a trade that would change the course of their destiny. They gained something that no other land mammal had perfected, a full-body cooling system based on evaporative efficiency. The secret was not just in sweating itself, but in the sheer density and distribution of eccrine glands. Unlike other mammals, who possess sweat glands mainly on their paws or snouts, humans came to house millions of them across nearly every surface of the body. No part was left behind. Arms, legs, back, chest, even the face. Each gland a miniature organ, devoted to thermoregulation. Each droplet a microscopic act of survival. This system did not evolve in isolation. It emerged hand in hand with behaviour, movement, tracking, pursuit. In the shimmering heat of the savannah, speed was not always the answer. The prey could run faster, yes, but it could not run forever. The great evolutionary advantage was not in acceleration, but in persistence, in the long, steady pursuit under a punishing sun. And here, the sweating body became a masterpiece of quiet engineering. As the antelope paused to pant, to cool, to hide, the hunter kept moving, cooling as he went, walking, not sprinting, enduring, not overpowering. It's easy to overlook the miracle of sweating. It is not dramatic like claws or fangs, not visible like wings or scales, but in the context of heat, it is unmatched. As sweat evaporates, it removes heat from the body with remarkable efficiency. For every gram of sweat that vanishes, 0.58 kilocalories of heat are lost. Multiply that by the tens of grams that fall in a sustained walk, and the body becomes a constantly adjusting furnace, always warming, always cooling, always balancing. The cost, of course, is water. Endurance comes with debt. To sweat is to dry out. To walk in heat is to gamble against dehydration. And so, water became sacred. The path of early humans began to trace the flow of rivers, the sparkle of oases, the shimmer of dew. They did not just learn to hunt. They learned to hydrate, to plan, to carry, to wait. This was not just biology, it was foresight. And in this foresight, the body became more than flesh. It became a story of risk and reward, of movement and memory, of chasing animals not by force, but by outlasting them. The sweating body told the world, I do not need to be faster. I only need to keep going when you cannot. And this act of keeping going, became the quiet revolution of our kind. Across the expanding savannas as forests shrank and the days grew longer, early humans transformed the very meaning of the hunt. They became, quite literally, the first marathoners, not in stadiums, not with cheering crowds, but out on the open plains with nothing but the heat and the wind and the slow rhythm of their footsteps. Endurance hunting was not sport. It was survival sculpted into movement. The technique was as elegant as it was brutal. It began in the cool morning when the ground still held the chill of night. A group would spot an animal, a kudu perhaps or a zebra, and begin the chase, but they would not rush. They would follow at a steady jog, conserving energy, watching for signs. The prey would sprint ahead, escaping easily at first, but it would need to stop to cool down, to pant, to rest in shade. And each time it did, the humans closed the distance, slowly, quietly, again and again. By midday, the animal's reserves would falter. The sun would no longer offer mercy. The muscles would seize, the lungs would overheat, the heart would pound against the limits of its design. And the humans, sweating, breathing, moving, would still be there, relentless. When the kill came, it was not with a heroic pounce or a sudden strike. It came with exhaustion, collapse. Endurance won where strength could not. This strategy could not have worked with fur. The heat would have killed the hunter as swiftly as the prey. But the naked skin, the sweating brow, the long limbs, they turned the body into a moving radiator, a biological machine tuned by climate and pressure that could hunt not with speed, but with time. And so, a new relationship formed between the human body and the sun. What had once been an adversary became a partner. The heat no longer chased our ancestors back to the shade. It cleared the way ahead. It thinned the herds, it levelled the field, and the humans walked forward through it, not in defiance, but in communion. Even today, our physiology remembers. Our ability to run long distances, to sweat profusely, to regulate internal temperature with precision. These are not recent traits. They are ancient signatures written into our blood, our glands, our breath. The marathon is not a modern invention. It is a reenactment, a ritual performance of what once kept us alive. And beneath all of this lies the skin, bare, darkened, sweating. It is our oldest tool, and perhaps our most underestimated one. It is where the great shedding culminated, not in the disappearance of fur, but in the emergence of something far more radical. A body designed not to rest, but to continue, to keep walking, to keep breathing, to carry the hunt through the burning hours of the day until the horizon itself surrendered. It was not merely a change in form, it was a change in tempo. The rhythm of life slowed and stretched, syncing not with the rush of muscle, but with the slow cadence of heat. This endurance reshaped not only the body, but also the mind. Persistence hunting demanded not only physical stamina but cognitive patience. It required reading the terrain, tracking signs over hours, remembering paths, anticipating movements. A mental map began to form alongside the physical one, not just of space, but of time. This was the quiet dawn of strategy, of foresight, of intention. Not the abstract reasoning of symbolic thought, that would come later, but the foundation for it. The body, stripped of fur and cooled by sweat, had enabled a new kind of thinking, slow, observant, connected to the environment. The nervous system tuned itself to cues, the shimmer of distant movement, the angle of the sun, the smell of disturbed grass. Awareness deepened. Consciousness, in its earliest form, expanded beyond the self. And what of the skin, now exposed to the world? It became more than an organ. It became an instrument of perception. Touch, previously muted beneath fur, became acute. The world arrived directly at the surface of the body. Temperature shifts, breeze, contact, injury, all now transmitted in high fidelity. The skin, with its millions of nerve endings, became the body's most honest narrator. It could not lie. It registered the world precisely and persistently, even when the mind might try to turn away. But exposure brought vulnerability too. Without fur, the body was open to cold, to biting insects, to wounds. And yet, evolution did not reverse course, because the gains were greater. The trade-offs, though harsh, were acceptable. We learned to shelter. We learned to cover ourselves with smoke, with mud, eventually with hides and cloth. But we did not grow the fur back. The cost of nakedness was outweighed by the advantage of movement and of the mind that emerged from it. There's a strange poetry in this loss. The very thing that once marked our mammalian identity, fur, became an obstacle, and in letting it go we stepped into something new. We became the creatures who trusted their endurance more than their armour. We became the ones who felt the wind, and this trust, once built into the body, seeped into our culture. Across the ages, long after the savannas, humans continued to walk. Across continents, across deserts, across ice. The sweating, pacing body became our inheritance, the original design upon which all later layers were added. The tools, the fire, the language, they came later. But before all of that, there was skin, there was sun, and there was the road. And that road stretched ahead, gleaming with heat, a path not paved by ambition or conquest, but carved by necessity, and by the patience of countless generations who shed what no longer served them, and stepped forward. This was not just a physiological revolution. It was the dawn of a different kind of relationship between our species and the world. Without fur to shield us, we were no longer insulated from nature's touch. We were immersed in it. The sun scorched, but it also guided. The wind dried, but it also warned. The body became porous to experience, and with that porousness came awareness, not only of external conditions but of internal states. We began to listen to thirst, to fatigue, to the tightness in the chest that comes with the crest of a hill. These signals, once muffled by fur and instinct, now became part of how we navigated. And evolution followed this attentiveness. The nervous system adapted. The brain grew not only in size, but in complexity. Thermoregulation is no simple trick. It requires careful monitoring, feedback loops, and prediction. Every step under the sun was a negotiation between exertion and preservation, and each successful negotiation left its trace. Neurons fired, connections strengthened, memory expanded. A mind built for movement was also, unexpectedly, a mind built for modelling. It is here, perhaps, that the shedding of fur intersects most deeply with the story of consciousness. Because to regulate heat, one must anticipate heat. To hunt by endurance, one must think not just of the now, but of the next. The body that ran under the sun did not just survive, it learned. The mind grew in the shadow of the fire it endured. The body then became both map and mirror. Its skin tracked the sun's passage. Its sweat marked effort like ink on a page. And though this shedding began as necessity, a mechanical adaptation to overheating, it became something more. It became a kind of clarity, a biological unveiling, a way for the human form to become more intimate with its environment, more reflective of its conditions, more open to its own becoming. Even today, long after the savanna has receded into history, we carry this legacy. Our need for hydration, our tolerance for heat, our ability to pace ourselves over long distances, our capacity to think while moving. These are not modern traits. They are ancient strategies still encoded in every cell. We are the descendants of those who could endure, of those who, beneath the burning sun, traded fur for foresight. And perhaps that's the secret history buried in every bead of sweat, not just a cooling mechanism, but a signal, that we chose exposure over safety, that we walked not just to chase, but to change, that something essential was born in the heat when the body stood bare beneath the sky, shimmering with salt and breath. The sweating ape was not a mistake of nature. It was nature's boldest experiment, to create a creature not protected by fur but empowered by vulnerability. A creature built not just to survive the burning world, but to understand it. The snow did not come all at once. It crept, slowly, over centuries, a breath that became a wind, a whisper that became a gale, and beneath that pale breath the world we had once run across, bare-skinned and gleaming with sweat, began to harden. The savannas, once shimmering with golden grasses and heat-hazed horizons, gave way to something colder, something wilder. Ice, ancient and indifferent, uncoiled from the poles, crawling south like a patient predator. The Pleistocene had arrived, and with it, a new tempo to life, a staccato of seasons, a rhythm no longer built on heat, but on scarcity, on frost, on the long silence between thaws. What happens to a creature made for endurance when the world it was built to endure begins to vanish beneath layers of snow and shadow? For nearly 2 million years, the hairless hominins had evolved under an open sun, casting long shadows across open plains. Their bare skin was not a weakness, but a strategy, a living system engineered to cool, to chase, to endure. But now, the very sun that once partnered with the body had grown thin and distant. Winters deepened, rain failed, forests receded, glaciers descended like white knives, carving valleys, shifting rivers, reshaping the stage upon which life had once moved freely. The Pleistocene was not a single ice age, but a tapestry of shifting pulses, over 20 glacial advances in just the last 2.5 million years. Each pulse sent waves of disruption across continents, ecosystems fractured, sea levels rose and fell like breath, animals migrated or vanished. Populations of humans, or the many forms of human ancestors, were cast into isolation. Some fled south, back toward the equator, clinging to warmth. Others remained, trapped or rooted in northern latitudes, where survival was not just a matter of strength, but of resilience, of innovation, of adaptation. In this fractured world, evolution found new canvases. Cold was no longer an occasional trial, but a defining presence. Where once the body's primary enemy was heat, now it was the absence of warmth itself. Hypothermia, not overheating, became the great reaper. And with this shift came a new kind of pressure, not toward speed, but toward conservation, not toward shedding, but toward sheltering. What adaptations could serve a naked ape beneath a pale sky? Could the very trait that had once liberated us, our skin, now become a liability? And so, in pockets of this frozen world, something curious began to stir once more. Not quickly, not universally. But in scattered populations, those caught in the grip of glaciated winds, those who could not escape back to equatorial refuge, the body began to remember. Deep in the genomic archive, the blueprint for fur was never erased. It was merely folded away like a coat left behind in better weather. Now, in these margins of the ice, evolution quietly opened the drawer. What happens when a body built to sweat begins to grow cold faster than it can adapt? What memory lies dormant in the skin, waiting only for the right wind to call it forth? In the grip of the glacial epochs, the answer began to whisper across generations. The cold, though slow in its arrival, was unrelenting in its verdict. Those whose bodies could resist it survived longer, raised more children, passed on more of their blood. Fur, though long lost, had not vanished from the genome. It slumbered in the base pairs, in the ancient scaffolding that once shaped a forest-dwelling primate. And so, in these windswept outposts of the north, a faint return began. Not the full pelt of an ancestor, but a soft resurgence, denser body hair, more insulating fat, pale skin beginning to emerge beneath sparse coats. This was not a reversal. It was a recursion. Evolution, like climate, is not linear. It folds back on itself, loops, pauses, adapts with memory. The northern hominins, among them populations we now call Neanderthals, became testaments to this spiral. Stockier bodies, broader noses, shorter limbs that conserved heat, and yes, more hair. The kind that did not cover like fur but broke the wind, slowed the loss, made each degree of warmth hold a little longer. Life in the north was a siege. Fire helped, but fire needed fuel. Clothing helped, but clothing required tools, planning, materials. Shelters helped, but they did not move with the herds, and so the body too had to bear its share. The return of hair, even in part, was not regression. It was collaboration. The genome offered its quiet contribution to the cold, a compromise between what we were and what we might need to be again. Meanwhile, farther south, other bands of Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens continued to follow the sun. In their world, sweating remained sacred. Hairlessness remained an edge. The body stayed lean, swift, open to the wind. Two paths, one of shedding, one of reclaiming, split from a shared ancestor and began to reflect two very different answers to the same question. What does it mean to be human in a changing world? It is tempting to imagine a single trajectory, a march from primitive to modern, from fur to fabric. But the truth, as always, is more entangled. Evolution is local. It listens to the wind. It listens to what works here, now, again and again. And so, on the icy steppes of Europe and Central Asia, human forms bent toward the cold. Their bodies adapted not with the abstract genius of civilization, but with the old tools, bone, fat, skin, hair. And the cost of this adaptation was intimacy. For these were the hominins most shaped by hardship, by the long winters, by the hunting of beasts larger and fiercer than any before, by the need to huddle, to plan, to remember where warmth could be found. The northern brain adapted too, growing ever more dependent on cooperation, foresight, and the rituals that carried memory across the snow. In the shadow of the storm, survival meant listening not only to the world, but to the body's own ancient voice, a voice that sometimes spoke in fur. But the conversation was never one-sided. For even as the body remembered its old protections, it did so in negotiation with the mind, which had begun to speak more clearly, more insistently, through the shaping of tools and the weaving of habit. In the colder zones of the Pleistocene, evolution didn't just favour those who could grow more hair, it favoured those who could solve problems. The re-emergence of body hair was modest compared to what ingenuity allowed. Furs stripped from hunted animals, layered skins, shelters dug into hillsides, fires tended through long dark nights. And yet, the subtle return of hair mattered. In an environment where minutes in the open could chill bone, every edge mattered. The Neanderthals in particular bore witness to this edge. Their genes show traces of cold adaptation, not just in body shape, but in the expression of keratin, in traits linked to skin and hair. Some developed reddish tones in their body hair, perhaps due to mutations that helped modulate pigment and thermal absorption. Others show genes that hint at thicker body coverage, a tactile echo of the coats they once no longer needed, now partially returned under different skies. Meanwhile, isolation carved its own path. Populations fractured by glaciers or distance followed distinct evolutionary trails. In the warm refuges of Africa and southern Asia, hominins maintained their tropical physiology. But in the highlands and the permafrost, in the windswept plateaus and frozen valleys, bodies told another story. As migration routes narrowed and land bridges disappeared beneath glacial advances, groups were left to adapt or vanish. Many did vanish. But those who survived bore adaptations etched not in culture alone, but in their very flesh. Still, this return to hair was never complete. It was not a reversal to the forest-draped ancestors of the Miocene. The fully furred ape did not come back. Instead, what emerged was a hybrid, a hominin partially armoured by biology, partially by technology, and increasingly by knowledge passed down in story, in symbol, in shared memory. They wore the hides of the beasts they brought down, but beneath those hides, their bodies still bore the compromise. Some hair returned, yes, but never enough to make clothing obsolete. The reliance on external warmth had become permanent. In that there was a strange truth. The fur did not return because it no longer needed to. What had begun as a loss, an exposure, had by now become a foundation for something else. We were no longer merely bodies adapting to climates. We were minds adapting to challenge. And in that mind, a new kind of memory began to form. Not genetic, but cultural. A memory carried not by the skin, but by the firelight, and the stories told beside it. So even as the ice pushed against the edges of the world, and bodies bent to meet the storm, the fur that crept back in whispers was outpaced by another inheritance, the one that taught us how to survive without it. Yet this balance was delicate, and the storm was never just weather. The Pleistocene ice ages brought more than cold, they brought volatility. Each glacial period was followed by interglacials, brief warmer spells when the ice retreated and ecosystems reshuffled like a scattered deck. What one generation adapted to, the next might find transformed. Lakes appeared where once there were plains. Forests withdrew, then crept forward again. Rain fell in strange rhythms. With every pulse of the ice, life had to begin again, recalibrate, reclaim. In this churning world, populations rose and fell not only because of predators or hunger, but because of climate's merciless arithmetic. Cold alone did not kill. Unpredictability did. Those who could not adjust, whether biologically, behaviourally, or socially, faded. Extinction became a familiar echo. Whole branches of the human tree withered in the frost. Others hung on, clustered in refugia, temperate pockets between mountain ranges or along ice-free coastlines, where food still flowed and fire could be sustained. These were the crucibles of innovation and endurance. It was in these pockets that new skills emerged and old ones were preserved. Here too, body hair offered its quiet support, a buffer, a margin of error. In the moments between the fire going out and the new one catching, it bought a few extra minutes. In the long trek across windswept tundra, it caught the warmth of movement and held it close. Even modest gains, thicker vellus hair, subtle changes in growth patterns, could matter when survival balanced on such a thin edge. And yet, even as the cold demanded more from the body, it also deepened what we might call our relational intelligence, because to survive the cold meant surviving together. Fur could cover an individual, but clothing had to be shared, taught, stitched. Fire had to be tended by more than one. The cold made us more human, not by turning us back into animals, but by making us more reliant on each other, on cooperation, on language, on care. To keep warm was not just an act of biology, it was an act of community. The body may have gestured back toward fur, but the species was moving forward toward something else, culture as adaptation. And in this fragile loop where biology met behaviour, something extraordinary occurred. The very pressures that encouraged hair's partial return also drove forward symbolic thought, ritual burial, and perhaps even the early murmurings of myth. It is no coincidence that some of the oldest known cave art appears in the coldest regions. When survival becomes uncertain, meaning becomes necessary. And so, the storm was not just endured, it was interpreted. Its winds became metaphors, its ice, memory, its hardship, a forge. The human body might still carry the echo of fur in its follicles, but the human story had already shifted. Beneath the blizzards, under layers of hide and hearth, something else had awakened, a new way to belong in the world. But the past does not leave us. It lingers in bone, in skin, in the subtle languages of our cells. Even today, the echo of those Pleistocene winters can be traced in our biology. Genetic studies reveal inherited markers from ancient hominins, Neanderthal, Denisovan, embedded in the DNA of many modern humans. Among these markers are those tied to hair, to skin regulation, to metabolism under cold stress. It is not just culture that endures. The cold left its fingerprints on our bodies, and so we carry both legacies, the sweating skin of equatorial runners and the cold weather genes of firelit ancestors. We are creatures of dual inheritance, moulded by light and frost alike. The return of body hair in some groups was not a full retreat, but a flexing of evolutionary memory, a gentle reminder that adaptation is never finished, that what is lost can sometimes be called back when the world demands it. Even now, differences in hair density, distribution and follicle behaviour speak to these ancient divergences, shadows of Ice Age journeys written in the quiet language of our pores. Yet this return never truly threatened to overturn the great shedding that had defined our lineage. By the time the glaciers arrived in a force, the trajectory of humanity had already curved toward the external. Tools, fire, clothing, shelter, and eventually abstract thought, these became our true adaptations. The body played its part, yes, but it was the mind that now danced with the climate, responding not just with reflex but with imagination. As the last ice age waned and the glaciers withdrew once more, many of the cold-adapted lineages vanished. Some were absorbed, their genes diffused through interbreeding. Others disappeared entirely, leaving behind bones, tools, and genetic whispers. The re-emergence of fur had served its moment, a biological bridge across a frozen era. But as temperatures rose again and grasslands reawakened, the naked skin of the sweating ape once more came into its own. The rhythm of heat returned, the sun resumed its watch over the plains. Still, the memory of the storm remains, not only in our bodies but in the stories we tell, of struggle, of exile, of resilience. The myths that speak of great floods, long nights, and white horizons are more than metaphor. They are echoes of a time when the very air we breathed could freeze, and when the warmth of another's presence was the most valuable resource of all. In the end, fur did not return as destiny. It returned as possibility. A brief chapter in our great unwritten text, a line scrawled in frost before being melted away. We remember it not as a failure of progress, but as evidence of nature's willingness to try again, to adapt in any direction needed. And so, from the silence of the canopy to the thunder of glaciers, the body has bent and bowed to time's command. But through every shift one thing has endured, the will to continue and the skin, furred, bare or clothed, that has carried us forward. What does it mean to shed something twice? To evolve not only forward, but in a circle, to lose, reclaim and then relinquish again. When the great ice sheets finally loosened their grip on the land, when the vast winds calmed and green once more unfurled across the continents, something ancient stirred within the skin of our ancestors. Beneath that returning sun they began to shed once more, not their tools or memories, but the very same fur they had lost millennia before. Evolution, like the climate that sculpted it, had come around again. The Ice Age had held the world in a vice of silence and hunger, but now the glaciers groaned and collapsed, surrendering their empire. Forests crept back like forgotten songs, rivers thawed and wandered, and with this thaw came motion, a slow migration, not of conquest, but of return. Hominins, long adapted to cold steppe endurance, began to drift southward, following prey and seasons into warmer lands. These were not the same creatures who had once fled the tropics into frost. They were altered, tempered, tested, but in their bodies still echoed the long memory of fire, of shelter, of fur's forgotten warmth. And the sun was waiting. Tropical environments are not merely hot, they are relentless, moist, thick with humidity and radiation. In this world, the adaptations that once preserved warmth became burdens. Body hair, even in its sparse post-glacial resurgence, became a trap for heat. The very follicles that once cradled warmth now clung to sweat, smothered the skin's breath. The balance had tipped again. Just as before, natural selection moved in quiet, imperceptible ways, not erasing overnight, but rewarding those whose bodies shed heat better, whose skin shimmered instead of suffocated. Survival did not require genius. It required permeability. This is the first mystery the body had to solve once more. How do you stay cool when the air no longer helps you? It is not that hair disappeared everywhere or at once. It faded unevenly, in waves, in regions. In tropical zones the shedding was dramatic. In others, more moderate. The rules were not absolute, but the pattern was clear. The second shedding, subtler than the first, less revolutionary perhaps, but just as significant, became a quiet signature written in sweat and skin. And what does it say about us that the same solution emerged twice? That fur was not only lost but relearned, and then lost again. Is this not the very definition of adaptability? Beneath the surface, this story reveals a truth more profound than temperature. It suggests that evolution is not a straight path forward, but a series of loops, spirals, retracings. Like the tides, like memory, it returns to what it once was, only changed. So we must ask, how many times have we been remade by the same elements? How many traits lie dormant in us, waiting to rise again with the right wind? To the eye, evolution can seem like progress, a ladder or a line. But in the intimate workings of biology, it is more like a river's course, meandering, folding back on itself, always shaped by the terrain it moves through. When the climate warmed and the south beckoned, the human form once again began to reflect the logic of heat. Limbs lengthened, torsos narrowed, faces grew finer, shedding insulation. But more telling than any of these was the soft, quiet reversal of an earlier adaptation. The fur that had crept back in colder times began to thin again. Here, the concept of evolutionary reversibility reveals its strange logic. Traits, once discarded, are not always gone. Some linger in genetic memory, switched off rather than erased, waiting for new environmental cues to reawaken or recede. Like light filtering through a dense canopy, the full expression of our genetic potential is dappled, partial, situational, a play between silence and song. Body hair is just such a trait. It can return in whispers, it can vanish in silence, and it does so not with drama, but with generations of nudges, thousands of tiny verdicts passed by heat, by skin, by the breath of the wind against a child's cheek. In tropical readaptation, this reversal was no accident. It was survival. In equatorial zones, sweating isn't merely advantageous, it is vital. Humans cool not primarily through panting, like many mammals, but through evaporative cooling across a wide, mostly hairless surface. Fur interrupts that process. And so, in the equatorial forests and savannas, bare skin reasserted its value. The sweat glands flourished. The hair follicles, now redundant, grew finer, or ceased to express altogether. The second shedding had begun, less visible perhaps than the first, but no less profound. This slow forgetting of fur was not uniform across the globe. As some populations moved into shaded rainforests, others crossed open grasslands or coastlines. Geography again sculpted biology. In regions where the sun bore down hardest, selection strongly favoured hairlessness. In others, where shade or altitude offered reprieve, the shedding was partial or absent. These patterns endure even today, reflected in the astonishing variety of human skin, hair and sweat physiology across populations. It is not simply cultural diversity we see, but evolutionary memory, environmental signatures written into bodies. And always migration danced with climate. As groups moved, they carried their traits with them, not always well matched to their new homes. Sometimes this mismatch meant struggle. Other times it sparked a new turn in the evolutionary wheel, a third path shaped by hybrid pressures. Each migration was not just a journey through land, but through temperature, moisture, ultraviolet light. Each trek rewrote the skin, and the skin, in turn, rewrote the story. To understand the second shedding is to understand that the body is not merely a vessel, but a canvas of the climates it has survived. This new phase of evolutionary change was not a clean slate, but a palimpsest. Old scripts half erased, new ones scrawled atop them, both whispering through the layers. Fur, sweat, pigment, shape, all of it shaped by the dialogue between body and world. The sun's return to dominance was not met with panic, but with adaptation that was already primed by the past. The human form had shed once before, it remembered how. Among post-glacial populations who drifted into the warm equatorial zones of Africa, South Asia and Oceania, natural selection began to refavour the same physiological traits that had allowed Homo erectus and other early hominins to thrive in heat. The body that had endured the blizzards now began, generation by generation, to reforge itself for the horizon of fire. Endurance remained essential, but the kind of endurance had shifted. Now it was not for cold, but for distance in heat. Long-distance walking across savanna required a skin that breathed, limbs that radiated heat, and the capacity to sweat without suffocating. The second shedding was not merely a rollback, it was an adjustment built on top of complexity. Even in tropical adapted groups, the body did not return to the exact state it had held in the Miocene or early Pleistocene. Instead, it fused old strategies with new ones. For instance, while body hair thinned or disappeared in many regions, the fine-tuned control of blood flow to the skin, a trait honed in the cold, remained. This allowed the body to better manage heat even in high temperatures. In other words, the second shedding carried the residue of what had come before. It was not a simple reset. It was an evolution layered over an evolution. There is a quiet grandeur in this, in how the body can bend both forward and back without breaking, in how reversibility does not mean erasure, but refinement. Some traits remained hidden, ready to re-emerge if the world turned cold again. Others were fully embraced, their old forms abandoned. This ability, to be fluid, to move within a spectrum rather than toward a fixed ideal, is part of what made our species not only survive but spread. We are not a monument to a single adaptation. We are a living map of changing winds. Migration and mutation worked in tandem, sculpting the body as it walked under shifting skies. The interplay between movement and climate was never static. Each step southward brought new selective pressures. Each new horizon challenged the body's strategies, and as communities settled and flourished in these reborn tropics, the human form responded gently over generations by shedding once more. The fur that had returned in ice now fell away in fire, not in clumps or seasons, but in the slow rhythm of lineage. It was not dramatic, it was not even noticed, but it was happening nonetheless. And that is how most transformations in deep time occur, not in epiphany, but in subtle drift. One generation sees the world much like the last. It is only from far above, in the gaze of millennia, that the arc of change reveals itself. The post-glacial hominins who returned to warmth did not feel themselves evolving. They hunted, gathered, cradled their children, shaped stones and seeds, all while their bodies recalibrated beneath their skin. A strand of hair here, a shift in sweat production there, 1,000 quiet decisions whispered into the gene pool, until the change was no longer potential, but fact. Even now, the science of this period continues to reveal new layers. Studies of skin pigmentation, for instance, show that adaptations to UV radiation occurred multiple times and in multiple places, an example of convergent evolution in which separate populations found similar solutions to the same problem. Melanin deepened to protect DNA from sunburn, sweat glands proliferated, hair thinned, and within this, body form shifted too. Populations in hotter regions often developed what anthropologists call a tropical body plan, taller, leaner, with long limbs that radiate heat more efficiently. A living response to thermodynamic laws. It is no accident. It is a song sung between physics and flesh. Yet as some moved south, others remained behind, in temperate zones, in mountains, in shifting borderlands between heat and frost. The human story was never singular. It was a mosaic of migrations, each group carrying its own balance of cold memory and heat adaptation. In these crossroads, the second shedding may have been partial, incomplete, or reversed yet again. This reveals the complexity of reversibility. It is not a clean backtrack, but a spectrum of possibilities. Evolution is not like undoing a step on a path. It is like reweaving a tapestry, strand by strand, under new light. And so the interplay between climate, migration, and body form became the hidden scaffold of human history. These were not external changes alone. They shaped culture too. The body defines how long one can hunt, how far one can walk, what times of day are best for labour. A hairless body under a high sun favours movement in dawn and dusk. A a sweating skin encourages shade, rest, water-seeking. Even social behaviours, the building of shelter, the sharing of burdens, ripple outward from these physiological truths. This is the quiet power of the second shedding, not just in its genetic footprint, but in its shaping of how early humans lived, moved, and formed bonds. The body is the first tool, and as it changes, so too do the strategies of survival. Shedding in this sense is not only a physical release, it is a reorientation, a renewal, a recalibration to a world that is no longer frozen. The glaciers had retreated, the sun had returned, and so had the skin beneath the fur, glistening, ready once more to walk beneath the stars. In this reawakening, the human body bore the memory of two climates, two migrations, two selves. One forged in frost, wrapped in the whisper of wind and the logic of fur. The other, ancient yet reborn, sculpted for the equator's breath and the horizon's fire. This duality, not erased but integrated, is the essence of the human condition. We are, in our very biology, the children of opposites, of ice and heat, of shadow and blaze. We are the descendants of both the cloaked and the naked, and within this tension lies resilience. Evolution did not choose one form and discard the other forever. Instead, it allowed the human form to drift between states, to flex with the seasons of the earth. This fluidity is what made Homo sapiens not only successful, but expansive. We were not fixed to one environment or one strategy. We were adaptable, and that adaptability lived first in the skin. The second shedding is not as well known as the first, not as dramatic as the rise of bipedalism, nor as iconic as the invention of fire. But it is perhaps more quietly profound. It speaks to the idea that evolution is iterative, that nature returns to previous answers when conditions call for them. It shows that progress, in the Darwinian sense, is not a straight climb but a dance with the landscape. Fur was useful once, then it was not. Then for some, it was again. And then, once more, it faded like snow under the morning sun. The implications of this cycle stretch into the present. Even now, modern humans carry traces of both adaptations, genetic remnants of hair density, sweat efficiency, and thermal regulation vary across populations, not randomly, but in patterns that mirror ancient climates and migrations. In our bodies today, you can still read the stories of where our ancestors walked, what they endured, and how the planet wrote itself into their flesh. And beyond the science, there is something deeply poetic in this rhythm, in the way the earth sculpts its creatures with repeated brushstrokes, in the way the past is never truly gone, only waiting for the right temperature to speak again. The second shedding reminds us that identity, even at the level of skin and hair, is a process, not a destination. We are never finished. We are always becoming. So when we speak of being human, we must include this, that we are made of change, that our very skin has learned to forget and remember, to lose and find, not once but twice. The wind may shift, the forest may burn, the glaciers may rise again, and still the body will listen and answer in kind. For in every pore, in every drop of sweat, in every silent follicle, there echoes a truth as old as the sun, that to live is to adapt, and to adapt is to shed, again and again, as long as the earth turns. The midday plains were a place of silence, not because nothing moved, but because everything fled the heat. The sun, suspended high above the savannah, cast no shadow and offered no reprieve. It did not roar or burn in bursts, it pressed, steadily, endlessly, like a weight upon the world. And in this open furnace, something remarkable began to emerge, a creature not built to kill swiftly or strike from hiding, but to simply keep going, long after all others had stopped. Here, nakedness was no weakness. It was a triumph of biology. It was a weapon forged in sweat and patience. What kind of animal hunts with heat, not speed? What kind of predator wins not by ambush or fang, but by slowly eroding the strength of its prey with its own endurance? Beneath the African sun, Homo erectus stepped fully into its strange new role, the long-distance runner of the mammalian world. Most predators relied on short, explosive bursts, their muscles like springs wound tightly, needing rest after each pounce. But for Homo erectus, the body was being retooled into something altogether different. Lean, upright, breathing with the rhythm of footfall cooling through a river of sweat. Where others stopped, it continued. Where others panted and collapsed, it walked onward. Endurance hunting, the quiet, methodical pursuit of a prey animal over hours, even days, was not only a test of strength, it was a conversation between bodies. The human runner and the antelope were both reading the same signs: the heat of the earth, the shimmer of rising air, the patterns of hoofprint and heartbeat. But only one was evolving to master that exchange. Only one was adapting to turn the brutal impartiality of climate into a tool of survival. The transformation was not purely physical. It demanded intention. It demanded patience, memory, and teamwork. Tracking required reading landscapes like texts, deciphering the faintest impressions in soil, the broken blade of grass, the interrupted flock of birds. Coordinating a chase meant shared goals, trust in others' paths, and anticipation of not just where the animal was, but where it would collapse. In these long pursuits, cooperation became not just useful but vital, and so did communication, not necessarily in words but in gesture, glance, breath. What began as a biological adaptation soon echoed into the mind, the tribe, the story. But even before language emerged, the body had begun to tell a story of its own. The hairless skin, once a liability in colder forests, became a canvas for survival. With every step, sweat rose from the pores, beading, then vanishing into vapour, drawing heat away from the core. It was invisible armour, a slow-burning engine that let the human form run not faster than others, but longer. Much, much longer. How strange it must have seemed, to the eyes of a predator crouched in the shade, or a herd animal pausing in panic, to see this upright figure not sprinting, not shouting, but walking. Still walking, always walking. That was the terror of it. Not speed, but inevitability. Prey animals, built for bursts and leaps, would sprint to safety in the first minutes, but heat, not legs, would determine the outcome. As the sun rose higher, the cooling strategies of antelope, zebra, and kudu began to fail. Unlike humans, they could not sweat efficiently. Their bodies held heat like a cup holds water. Once full, there was nowhere for it to go. To avoid collapse, they were forced to stop, pant, and seek shade. But the human did not stop. The human was still coming. This was not a lone endeavour. Endurance hunting, though sometimes imagined as a solitary pursuit, flourished in the context of community. Multiple runners could trade places, circling, fanning out, communicating over distance with calls, gestures, or simple shared intuition. One would take the lead while another tracked from the flank. They would anticipate the terrain, guide the animal into open stretches, away from water or cover. Every decision made in the hunt was shaped by a map in the mind, of rivers, rocks, wind, and time, and every member of the group brought a piece of that map with them. This required not only strong legs, but deep memory. To be a successful hunter was to be a student of the land, to know where the herd would turn, how quickly it would tire, how the ground might change after rain. It meant knowing when to push, when to pause, and when to follow slowly, letting the animal spend its strength in panic. Victory came not from overpowering the prey, it came from waiting. Endurance hunting in many ways was a meditation. But this meditation was built on biology. The evolution of sweat glands in early Homo had already begun long before. Unlike most mammals, whose sweat is limited to specific parts of the body, or primarily used for scent, humans had evolved eccrine sweat glands, small, efficient, and spread across nearly the entire skin surface. These glands produced a watery secretion that evaporated rapidly, carrying heat away in the process. With each step, the body cooled. It could maintain effort not for minutes, but hours. Sweating also allowed for something else, an unprecedented level of stamina under stress. As the heart pumped blood to the surface, as salt and water were lost through the skin, early humans learned to pace themselves. They learned to listen to their own bodies and to each other. They developed strategies for hydration, for rest, for recovery. And over time these behaviours became cultural, taught, shared, passed on, not through genes alone, but through observation and imitation. The knowledge of how to run, how to endure, how to outlast became a legacy as real as stone tools. In this way, the sweating ape was not just shaped by its environment, it began to shape it in return. As fire would later transform the night, sweat transformed the day. It made the unwalkable walkable, the unhuntable huntable, and in doing so it made something else possible. Life not just lived, but expanded. Life that could follow the herd. Life that could chase the horizon. This new kind of mobility rewrote what it meant to survive on the African plains. The plains themselves were vast, shifting mosaics, dry one season, lush the next. Herds migrated across immense distances in response to rainfall, grass regrowth and predation pressure. But now, so could humans. Their bodies no longer limited by overheating. They could move with the seasons, shadowing the great animal migrations, weaving their lives into the rhythms of the ecosystem in a way no other predator could match. And in doing so, they changed the rules of the hunt. A lion could not travel for a full day in the heat without rest. A hyena's powerful jaws and sharp senses were bound to the same heat limits as its prey. But the human body, lean, upright, cooled by sweat and shaded by nothing but sky, could operate on a longer clock. The target did not need to be brought down in the first minute or the 10th, or even the 100th. The human strategy was time, wait, pursue, follow. And eventually, the animal would stop, not because it chose to, but because it had no choice. This method required foresight. The moment of collapse was never seen in advance. It arrived slowly, like dusk. The prey would begin to stumble, its gait would change, its breathing would become shallow. And then, somewhere beneath the brutal sun, it would pause, legs trembling, eyes glazed, and it would fall. That fall was not a violent one. Often there was no struggle, no final chase, just quietness. The animal had run out of heat margin, and the human had not. It is a hauntingly elegant dynamic, one that made our ancestors simultaneously lethal and invisible. They left no claw marks, no sprint trails, only footprints, sweat, and persistence. But to make use of such a kill, to butcher, to carry, to eat, required more than endurance. It required cooperation. One person alone could not consume or transport the whole of a downed kudu or zebra. This was not a solitary victory. It was a shared harvest. And that, in turn, demanded structure. Roles within the group, norms about sharing, tools for cutting, and eventually the means to cook. In this way, the act of running under the sun became inseparable from the origins of human society. Even those who did not run played roles. Some remained at camp. Others watched children, prepared water, or scouted for danger. The success of one depended on the stability of the whole. This gave rise to a kind of interdependence that became the skeleton of early human culture. Hunting was no longer just an interaction between predator and prey. It was an expression of a tribe's internal coherence, their ability to think together, to move with one body made of many. And at the heart of it all, unspoken, uncelebrated, was sweat. It is easy to overlook something so quiet, so constant. But it was this quiet that turned sunlight into strategy, that gave flesh to fire and made a simple body a machine of endurance. And like all tools, it reshaped the world around it. The naked skin, exposed and vulnerable at first glance, became the foundation of an entirely new ecological niche. The sweating body was not just tolerated by the environment, it was perfectly tuned to it. Where others hid from the sun, Homo erectus walked into it. Where heat meant retreat for most, it became an opportunity. It was not power in the traditional sense. There were no talons, no camouflage, no armour. There was only time, patience, and movement. But these traits accumulated. Over generations, they filtered through the body and the culture alike. The limbs of Homo erectus lengthened, especially the legs, to maximise stride. The Achilles tendon, absent in our more ancient ancestors, evolved to store and release energy with each step. The foot arched, turning from grasping branch tool to running spring. The gluteus muscles enlarged, not for sitting, but for stabilising the upright form in motion. Even the shape of the nose changed, evolving to better humidify air and conserve moisture in long runs under dry skies. All of this, the legs, the lungs, the sweat, the stride, whispered one thing: keep going. But to keep going, fuel was needed. Hunting provided protein and fat, but it came with costs. Hunting was risky. Prey could escape. Tools could fail. Injuries could linger. So humans supplemented. They began to dig for tubers, crack nuts, and scavenge what others left behind. They watched vultures to locate carcasses. They learned to read the tracks not just of antelope, but of other predators, arriving late to feast with fire-hardened sticks and sharpened stones. Their nakedness did not prevent them from thriving. It allowed them to diversify, to stretch out, to adapt not to one food source but to many. And it is here that we begin to see the deeper transformation. The body changed, yes, but the mind followed. Planning a pursuit over hours required more than strength. It required memory, anticipation, an understanding of terrain, time, and weather. It required the ability to put oneself in the mind of the animal, to guess its path, its exhaustion, its panic. In this way, the endurance hunter became not only a creature of muscle and sweat, but of imagination. This shift gave birth to something subtle and profound: empathy in the service of survival. To chase an animal over miles of wilderness was to learn its movements, not as a shadow, but as a reflection. This may well have been the soil from which other forms of empathy later grew. The ability to track not only hooves in the dust, but thoughts in the faces of others. And under it all still was the furnace. The plains burned, the air shimmered, and the human walked, glistening, upright, patient, guided by heat, by hunger, and by something just beginning to awaken behind the eyes. That awakening would not come all at once. It would flicker slowly across generations as understanding deepened and memory lengthened. But it began here, on these scorched plains, in the space between movement and stillness, between the pulse of pursuit and the quiet of preparation, and always the body led the way. Because here, on this land, the body became story. A story told through tendon and breath, through glistening skin and the echo of footfalls carried on wind. The nakedness of the human form was not a mistake or a deficit. It was a triumph, not of aggression, but of endurance. We often imagine strength as something loud, something immediate. But in the deep prehistory of our species, power was found in slowness, in outlasting, not outmuscling, in reading the signs of exhaustion in another being, in trusting the long, invisible rhythm of heat and heartbeat. Even now, the legacy is with us. The ability to sweat, to run long distances, to pace ourselves. These are not the relics of athletes alone. They are ancestral signatures, written into the very structure of what it means to be human. When we jog or hike or simply walk through heat with resolve, we echo movements millions of years old. Movements that once decided the fate of survival and that now remind us, in subtle ways, that we are still creatures of the sun. But this transformation came at a price. The same skin that cooled us also left us exposed, vulnerable to cold, to injury, to the demands of a world not always warm or welcoming. And in time, the world would change again. The climate would shift. Forests would retreat further, glaciers would press south, winds would sharpen, and the body, once perfectly attuned to heat, would need to adapt again, not by growing faster or smarter, but by learning how to keep what little warmth remained. The naked runners would face the test of the cold. Yet even then, in the long winters of future chapters, the wisdom of the furnace would remain. Because it had taught us more than how to move. It had taught us how to wait, how to work together, how to follow signs in the land, in the sky, in each other, and how to survive not just as individuals but as something more, as communities bound by memory, motion, and shared breath beneath a burning horizon. It is easy to miss the poetry in this, the soft, unseen elegance of a body glistening with sweat, paced by intention, shaped by sun and distance. But in that sweat lies the foundation of so much, of language, of cooperation, of civilization's quiet beginning. The sweating ape was not just born here, it began to dream here. The fur was gone, but the sun remained. And now, with nothing left to shield it, the skin stood alone beneath the burning sky, bare, vulnerable and unrelenting in its exposure. No longer wrapped in the protective coat that once buffered the forest's filtered rays, the human body entered a new age of reckoning. It was not just the muscles that had changed, nor merely the gait or the lungs. It was the largest organ of all, the skin, that now bore the full cost of survival in a world where light struck unbroken across open plains. For the first time in our lineage, we wore the world's temperature not as an environment, but as a second skin. What must it have felt like to step into that light for the first time and realize there was nowhere left to hide? And so pigment arose, not for beauty, not for decoration, but as a kind of armor, a biological shield forged in the quiet crucible of mutation and necessity. Melanin, a molecule so small it could sit invisible atop a single cell, would become one of evolution's most enduring answers to the sun's growing demands. It began as a whisper, a deepening hue in the epidermis, subtle and unseen. But over generations the pattern sharpened. Those whose skin could better scatter the sun's ultraviolet fury found themselves with fewer burns, fewer blisters, fewer cellular betrayals that bloomed into cancers. Their genes endured, their children thrived. This was not a change born in violence, but in time. The same sun that dried the sweat of a hunter, that shimmered across a brow heavy with the rhythm of the run, now shaped the very shade of the body it touched, not by choice, not by thought, but by pressure, by repetition, by the quiet arithmetic of advantage. And so, what began as exposure became adaptation. Melanin wrapped itself around DNA like a guardian, not only shielding the skin, but protecting the folate within, a fragile nutrient vital for fertility, fetal development, and the repair of life's intricate instructions. To lose too much folate under ultraviolet glare was to risk the blueprint of the next generation. In this way, the pigment became a keeper of lineage, a silent defender of tomorrow's births. But skin is never just biology. It is memory. It is boundary and inheritance, wound and canvas. As the bodies of early Homo sapiens grew darker under the African sun, they were not becoming alien. They were becoming rooted. Every shade of skin is a letter written by light, a sentence shaped by climate and carried forward in flesh. It is easy now, in a world of mirrors and artificial shade, to forget that this pigment once meant everything, that it was not merely colour, but survival, that it was not choice, but consequence. What happens when protection becomes visibility? What does it mean to wear your evolutionary history on the surface of your body? And who are we beneath that light? To the early humans, the answers were not intellectual. They were not framed in questions at all, but lived, felt in the sting of a burn, the resilience of the healed, the quiet sense that some bodies lasted longer in certain places. Beneath the sun of equatorial Africa, the skin thickened and darkened not as ornamentation, but as a homegrown layer of shelter. And yet, it was not uniform. Even here, in the crucible of our species, light and dark played across the canvas of the body in fine gradients. The genes that governed pigmentation danced with nuance, sculpting tones of ochre, bronze, shadow, and coal. Diversity was not deviation. It was default. This diversity was shaped not only by sun, but by distance. Human groups spread outward from regions of intense solar radiation toward dappled forests, coastal fogs, and eventually into the open arms of cooler latitudes. In each environment, the rules of light and biology whispered new instructions. Some genes favoured stronger melanin expression, offering deep protection in UV-rich zones. Others allowed for lighter pigmentation, a slow retraction of the solar curtain, where sunlight was softer but no less important. In these places, the need for vitamin D synthesis, triggered by ultraviolet exposure, became urgent. Too little vitamin D, and bones would falter, growth would stall. The very scaffolding of the body would soften under its own weight, and so evolution did not favour one skin over another, but adjusted its brushstroke to the needs of place. Each tone was a dialogue between geography and inheritance. In the tropics, pigment became shade. In the north, it became aperture, one absorbed, the other invited. The map of early human migrations can be traced not just through tools or bones, but through skin, this living parchment that records where the sun met the body and what compromises were made. This was not static. Pigment was never a fixed trait, but a responsive one, a reflection of changing skies, shifting seasons, and itinerant people. It did not harden into identity, but remained fluid, responding to climatic oscillations across millennia. And as groups mingled, through movement, through intimacy, through the slow, relentless process of human mingling, the genes behind skin colour recombined, rediscovered old expressions, or softened into new ones. The skin remembered where we had been, but it also prepared us for where we were going. In this there was something poetic and something immensely practical. Because while fur had once hidden and shielded us, it was now the very absence of fur and the presence of pigment that allowed us to endure, to stay visible without withering, to open ourselves to the elements and still persist. Skin, exposed and alive, became the compromise that kept us in motion, not hidden from the world, but meeting it fully. And the more we stepped into the sun, the more it shaped us, not only in what it burned, but in what it blessed. Each generation under the sky became a conversation between vulnerability and resilience. The human body, once draped in the camouflage of fur, now stood illuminated. There was no returning to the shadows of the canopy. The trade had already been made. We had become creatures of exposure, our sweat and stride making endurance possible, but our skin now asked a new question: how to survive not just in motion, but in light. Melanin answered, quietly but decisively. This humble molecule, produced by melanocytes nestled within the basal layer of the skin, carried out a task of immense importance. When ultraviolet radiation pierced the surface of the body, melanin absorbed and scattered its energy, transforming what might have been destructive into something manageable. It wrapped its shadow around the vulnerable machinery of life, protecting DNA from mutation, shielding folate from disintegration, and in doing so preserving not just the self, but the future encoded within it. And like all great adaptations, this one did not act in isolation. The genes responsible for pigmentation did not simply switch on or off. They modulated, they responded. Some individuals carried versions of these genes that allowed for deeper, richer pigmentation. Others bore variants that lightened the skin in places with less solar pressure. This was not randomness. It was a pattern of exquisite responsiveness, a balancing act between too much and too little, between the burn and the bone. In this dance between sunlight and biology, diversity was not only natural, it was inevitable. Across early populations of Homo sapiens, skin colour existed as a spectrum, shaped by the latitude of birth, the migration of ancestors, and the legacy of environments long departed. This is why, even among the earliest humans, genetic studies suggest a mosaic of skin tones, dark, darker, and lighter still, not divided by category, but connected by inheritance. It is tempting, perhaps, to look backward and assign modern constructs to ancient bodies, to imagine that skin colour meant then what it has come to mean now. But in those days, there was no hierarchy of hue. There was only the pragmatism of survival and the silent poetry of adaptation. Pigment was not social. It was solar. It was not yet identity. It was necessity. Still, there is something profoundly human in this layering of function and beauty, in the way the skin, stripped of fur, did not retreat but reinvented. It did not just protect, it reflected. It signalled health, lineage, readiness. It glowed with sweat, with movement, with life. Under a sky that gave freely but also took without mercy, the skin learned to speak a new language, a language of thresholds and tolerances, of melanin and UVB, of ancestors who stood beneath the same sun and emerged, not as one, but as many, carrying in their bodies the instructions of light rewritten again and again. This emergence was not just biological, it was ecological, social, and eventually philosophical. Early humans, runners, foragers, firekeepers, now carried their evolutionary history plainly on their skin. Pigment became the interface between body and world, a message coded in molecules that said, "I am shaped by the sun, but I remain unburned. This was the skin not of concealment, but of confrontation, not to wage war on the world, but to endure it. In that endurance, cooperation deepened. The long hunts, stretching across heat-heavy plains, required not only stamina but social synchrony. To move as a group beneath the sun meant understanding one another's pace, needs, thresholds, and skin, with its sheen of sweat and tone of health, became a quiet communicator. A runner's flush, the shine of dehydration, the pallor of illness, all could be read in the open canvas of the body. With fur gone, these signs became clearer, more immediate. The body no longer whispered its state, it declared it. And so, skin played a role in the silent choreography of group survival. Not only as a shield, but as a display. In this way, pigmentation intertwined with perception. Subtle changes in colour conveyed emotion, effort, exhaustion, visible even across distances. It was a new form of awareness, not abstracted in language, but immediate and embodied. As humans adapted to regions across Africa and far beyond, these tonal dialogues took on new hues. In dense equatorial forests, dark pigmentation remained crucial, shielding the body in regions where the sun filtered down with fierce precision. Along coastal savannas, where marine fog and cloud cover offered protection, lighter shades emerged. In the highlands, in river valleys, in dry open basins, the skin adjusted to each climate's demands again and again. What's striking is that these adaptations occurred not in isolation, but in a web of movement and mixing. Ancient DNA reveals that early Homo sapiens were not static tribes locked in place, but mobile, curious beings. They moved toward rivers, followed animals, traded stone, shared fire. Their genes travelled with them, and as populations mingled, their pigments did too, creating gradients that defied rigid classification. This reminds us that variation was not exception but norm, that the shades we see today, and the prejudices later attached to them, are recent inventions overlaid on ancient solutions. The skin did not draw borders, it crossed them. In this silent inheritance there is both humility and awe. For long before clothing, culture, or civilization marked our belonging, it was skin, luminous, expressive, and resilient, that told the story of where we had been and how we had survived. A story not of separation, but of sunlight, and the endless ways we learned to live within it. It is easy to overlook the skin, to think of it merely as surface, a covering, an edge. But in truth, it is one of our oldest organs of perception, a living record of deep time. Every inch of human skin, from the thickened soles of ancestral runners to the calloused fingers that carved stone, holds traces of what it took to live exposed. And among these adaptations, pigmentation may be the most poetic. It is colour born of necessity, shade as inheritance, a soft armour, always growing, always responding, never still. As the human story stretched out across continents, through windswept deserts, into humid jungles, over icy passes, our skin continued to adjust. It mirrored not only the UV index but the migrations of our kin. In some lineages, dark skin remained a vital adaptation, retaining its protective benefits across unchanging environments. In others, lighter skin emerged again, not as weakness, but as precision, a finely tuned response to sunlight scarcity, to the need for vitamin D synthesis where days were short and cold. But always, this change was slow. Evolution moves not with intent, but with consequence. The changes we see in skin colour today are the result of thousands upon thousands of generations. Minute shifts in gene frequency, spread by chance, by survival, by movement and mating. No single change defines us. It is the accumulation of countless small adjustments, each one a response to place, time, and need. And yet, despite this deep variability, humans remain remarkably similar beneath the surface. Our melanin pathways, no matter the expression, are governed by the same core mechanisms. Our needs, to regulate temperature, to synthesize nutrients, to protect DNA, are shared. The skin does not divide us. It reveals the continuity of our lineage, In this chapter of evolution, fur had long been traded away. Nakedness had become strength. Sweat, scent, and colour now worked in harmony to manage the demands of an open world, and the skin, once buried beneath hair, now stepped into its own. It adapted not by retreating, but by engaging, shielding without concealing, glowing without inflaming. This transformation gave rise to a new kind of relationship between the body and the world, one in which every breath of wind, every shaft of sunlight, every drop of rain touched us directly. It was no longer the fur that met the world. It was us, bare, aware, and luminous with the inheritance of the sun. And perhaps that is what makes the skin so much more than tissue, more than pigment. It is memory, it is response, it is the visible trace of eons spent beneath the sky, adapting not just to survive, but to belong. In its tones and textures, in its heat and healing, we find the story of our endurance, not hidden in the dark, but written in light. The long days gave way to longer nights. The sun's dominion ended not with darkness, but with flame. Firelight trembled against bare skin, the skin of the runners, the thinkers, the ones who had left the forest and never returned. For the first time, warmth did not come from fur or the embrace of another body, but from something external, alive, and obedient only to those who dared to hold it. It was not the sun that lit the faces of early humans now, but a smaller, tamed star, captured, sustained, and shared. No one knows when exactly it began. Some say the first flames were stolen, plucked from lightning-scorched trees after a storm, carried in smouldering branches across the plains. Others believe it was discovery through persistence, the grinding of stone, the friction of wood, the sheer curiosity of creatures already defined by their refusal to leave the unknown untested. However it happened, when those first sparks took root, they changed everything. Fire turned night into a new kind of space, one not ruled by fear, but by fascination. Before fire, the dark was absolute. Predators prowled unseen. The night was a world of eyes, of movement in the undergrowth, of vulnerability. But with the arrival of fire, the balance shifted. The glow drove back the beasts, extending the reach of safety beyond the frail boundaries of flesh. Warmth gathered the cold and weary into circles of survival. Around those circles, something unprecedented began to form. Not just comfort, but community. For the first time, the body could rest without retreating. Heat replaced fur, allowing the newly naked humans to inhabit open spaces that had once been unreachable. Fire became their blanket, their barrier, their heart. Its crackle became a language long before words did, a sound that meant presence, protection, persistence. Every ember, every hiss of sap within the flame was a heartbeat in the night. The world beyond the light remained vast, silent, and dangerous. But within its perimeter, a transformation was underway. The glow of the fire was more than physical illumination. It was conceptual. It revealed faces to one another, the flicker of eyes, the curve of mouths, the mirrored glow of shared reflection. Here, for the first time, humans could see themselves seeing each other. Awareness expanded outward and inward at once. What must it have felt like to sit beside that first campfire, feeling the warmth kiss the skin where once only fur had been? To stare into the flame and sense not fear but familiarity? What did they see in those dancing lights? A tool? A spirit? Or perhaps a reflection of their own awakening intelligence? The night had once belonged to others, to the leopard, the serpent, the great nocturnal hunters. Now it was shared. The first fires did more than change how our ancestors lived. They began to change what it meant to be human. The fire did not just offer warmth, it offered time. Before its light, nightfall meant withdrawal. The dark pressed close, and life retreated into silence until dawn. But now, beneath the slow breath of flame, the rhythm of existence stretched beyond daylight. Hours once surrendered to rest became hours of thought, of speech, of connection. Fire extended the day into the unknown. The The shadows it cast were long and alive. Faces flickered between light and obscurity, their expressions carved and revealed by the movement of flame. In that oscillation, a new kind of attention emerged, the awareness of self through others. When one spoke, another listened. When one moved, others watched. The circle of the fire became the circle of consciousness. Warmth allowed the body to rest, but light allowed the mind to wander. Freed from immediate survival, the mind began to play, to imagine. Stories may have begun here, not as performance, but as memory and warning. "There," someone might have said, pointing beyond the reach of the glow, "that is where the lion waited." A gesture, a sound, a mimic of claws, of pursuit. Laughter, perhaps, or the hushed stillness of recollection. These moments, repeated night after night, became tradition. Fire did not only preserve heat, it preserved history, and with fire came nourishment. Cooked food transformed not just digestion, but cognition. Meat softened in flame released more calories with less effort. Roots, once bitter or toxic, became edible. Firelight became a place of both safety and sustenance. What had once been raw became shared, and what was shared became ritual. Eating together meant survival together. The act itself carried meaning. It is difficult to overstate what this did to the human brain. Freed from the energy demands of constant chewing and raw digestion, our ancestors could divert more energy toward the growing organ within their skulls. Fire quite literally fueled intelligence. Around its glow, the first sparks of symbolic thought began to flicker. Not in words yet, but in gestures, in mimicry, in rhythm. Perhaps someone noticed that the crackle of wood followed a pattern, or that embers pulsed like stars. The mind, watching the fire, began to see patterns everywhere. That same pattern-seeking instinct gave rise to memory, to planning, to story. The human mind became a mirror of the flame, unstable, alive, flickering between clarity and chaos, between destruction and creation. And once imagination had been ignited, it could not be extinguished. Fire demanded care, and in caring for it, early humans learned constancy. The flame had to be fed, watched, protected through the night. It could not be left untended. This too became a lesson, that survival was not only about action, but about vigilance. Responsibility was born in the keeping of fire, and so the night, once feared and shunned, became sacred. The fire was not merely a tool, it was an awakening, the first quiet cathedral of light, where thought began to gather, glowing softly against the vast cold dark. And within that cathedral, the human voice began to evolve. No longer a cry of warning, no longer a call to hunt or a sound of fear, but something layered, deliberate, shaped. The voice became music, rhythm, story. The air above the flames filled with cadence and pattern, with meaning carried not by gesture but by sound itself. In the flicker of those first campfires, language began its long ascent from the breath. Imagine that scene. The crackling fire, the hush of night insects, the shifting chorus of a wind through grass. Around the glow sit faces gleaming with reflected orange, their eyes wide not with terror but with attention. One speaks, halting, simple, vivid. Another repeats, a third gestures. Slowly through the play of sound and expression, a common understanding takes form. The night becomes not just a boundary, but a stage. And from that stage something else emerges. Imagination with purpose. Those gathered around the flame begin to describe not only what is, but what was and what might be. They speak of animals seen and unseen, of hunts and storms, of ancestors and dreams. In those moments, memory extends beyond the individual mind and becomes shared property. To remember is no longer solitary, it is communal. The group begins to carry its collective past as one. The first stories were not myths, they were maps. They told where danger lurked, where water could be found, where the sky changed before dawn. But as they were told again and again, they began to take on something else, something more than function. In retelling, humans discovered the pleasure of narrative. The voice that described the hunt began to elaborate, to shape suspense, to pause at the moment of tension. The audience leaned closer. The teller learned the rhythm of anticipation. The Siechend, newly capable of abstract thought, began to experiment with wonder. Here, in the warmth of firelight, the first metaphors were born. The lion was not just a lion anymore. It became strength, spirit, omen. The night sky was not just distant points of light, but eyes of ancestors watching. Firelight became a lens for imagination, a small, trembling universe through which the world could be seen anew. Every flicker of shadow cast against a stone wall might have resembled something living. A bird, a beast, a running form. The boundary between light and dark became the canvas of the mind, and on that invisible canvas ideas began to paint themselves. The spark of fire had kindled a second fire, one that burned within. The light outside had made possible the light inside, and that inner fire would go on to illuminate everything that followed: art, belief, curiosity, and the endless human hunger to make meaning out of what the universe offered. Meaning, that was the true spark. Once the body had mastered endurance, once the skin had learned to withstand the sun, it was the mind's turn to transform, and meaning, unlike muscle, is born in silence. Fire created that silence, not emptiness but focus, a stillness within which thoughts could unfold. Before fire, night was a time of fear and hiding. After fire, it became a space for reflection. The flames danced and humans watched, and in that watching, they began to imagine not just what was visible, but what might exist beyond. Those glowing embers became a mirror for consciousness itself. Watch any fire long enough, and you'll notice it moves like thought, flickering, unpredictable, never still. It consumes, renews, collapses, and rises again. To sit by it is to feel time itself in motion. For our ancestors, it may have been the first meditation, the first encounter with the idea that something transient could also be eternal. As firelight traced patterns across the faces of the gathered, the seeds of symbolic thought began to grow. The human mind started to link the visible with the invisible. The heat that radiated from the flames might have felt like the breath of unseen forces, the spirits of ancestors, the will of the sky. Shadows moving beyond the light's edge took on new significance. The imagination, nourished by the rhythm of flame, began to populate the darkness with meaning. Fire did not only protect against predators, it also birthed them anew as ideas, creatures of myth, half-remembered animals, spirits that lived between worlds, all found their first home in the mind's glow. The earliest forms of belief were not superstition, they were curiosity made sacred. In a universe that had always been too large, too dangerous, and too quiet, fire gave humans a point of contact, a focus for awe. And with awe came creativity. The same sparks that kept predators away might have inspired the first gestures of art. Perhaps someone traced their hand in ash on a rock wall. Perhaps someone noticed how soot smudged a pattern that resembled motion, breath, or wind. The boundary between heat and darkness became the first canvas, and with it came the beginnings of symbolic thought. It was not yet religion or art as we know it, but it was the root of both, the moment when imagination sought to endure beyond speech. In the end, it was not fire alone that made humans different. It was what they did with it, how they saw in its glow a reflection of their own emerging interior world. The flames burned outward, but the spark turned inward, and something entirely new began. The realization that survival could give way to meaning, and meaning could last longer than the body that carried it. The body remembers what the earth forgets. Long before it spoke, before it dreamed, before it painted its own stories on stone, the human body carried within it the memory of the sea, salt coursing through blood, sweat glistening under the sun, tears marking both suffering and awe. Every droplet of salt water shed from the human form is an echo of that first ocean from which life emerged. Even now, when we sweat, we are repeating an ancient story of balance, the ceaseless negotiation between what must be kept inside and what must be released. In the beginning, it was only survival. Under the glare of the savannah's sun, sweat was our armour and our burden. The body cooled itself not by retreating but by surrender, by letting water go. To sweat was to endure, but endurance had a cost. The minerals that escaped with each drop, sodium, potassium, chloride, were not easily replaced. The salt of the body was precious. To lose too much was to court collapse, and so early humans learned to taste the earth, to lick stone, to crave what they had lost. Salt became more than substance. It became instinct. Our ancestors sought it wherever it hid, in the blood of prey, in the moisture of plants, in the brittle crust left on the edges of dry lakes. They learned through trial and error that salt meant survival. In its absence came cramps, confusion, a strange hollow fatigue that felt like fading itself. And so, when they found it, shimmering white against dark soil, or crusting the edges of a sun-scorched plain, it was gathered, carried, treasured. It was never wasted. But biology, when repeated long enough, becomes myth. The salt that sustained the body began to symbolize something deeper, the essence of persistence, the taste of the earth itself. Sweat became not only proof of exertion, but proof of life, a mark of devotion to the act of surviving. Hunters returning from the plains wore their labour like a blessing. The salt dried on their skin was a kind of map, the record of distance, heat, and endurance. Even now, salt carries a sacred ambiguity. It preserves and it burns. It purifies, yet it stings the wound. It is both substance and metaphor, bridging the material and the spiritual. And so, as human cognition deepened, the act of sweating, once a simple physiological miracle, became something the mind could not ignore. It marked the connection between effort and existence, between the interior and the infinite. When early humans gathered by the fire, glistening from a long hunt or a desperate run, they were not only cooling their bodies, they were participating in one of evolution's oldest rituals, the offering of salt to the air, to the ground, to the world that had shaped them. The salt of the body was not waste, it was tribute. What does it mean then to realize that every breath, every step, every shimmer of sweat upon the skin is not only a mechanism of survival, but a message written in salt, addressed to the earth itself? For the early humans who walked beneath unrelenting suns, that message was both literal and sacred. Salt was the invisible thread that bound life to land, flesh to soil. Every droplet that fell from the body carried with it minerals once cradled in oceans millions of years old. It was as if, through sweat, the sea continued to speak, whispering its memory into every heartbeat. The plains may have been far from any shore, but inside every runner, every mother, every sleeping child, the ocean still flowed. This continuity gave sweat a strange sanctity. It was not something to be hidden or shamed, but something to be honoured, evidence that the body was in conversation with the elements. Among later hunter-gatherer cultures, echoes of this reverence can still be found. Sweat became purification, a shedding of excess, a cleansing not just of heat but of heaviness. It was through exertion that one rejoined the rhythm of the earth. To sweat was to remember one's animalhood, to be reminded that survival was never stillness, but motion. The salt that gathered at the corners of the mouth, that stung the eyes, that slicked the arms in sunlight, was a declaration of belonging. It said, "I am part of this heat, this hunger, this heartbeat of land." The human body, once covered in fur, had become a conduit between the sky and the soil, radiating heat, shimmering with life, releasing the essence of its effort back to the ground from which it came. And yet, as cognition deepened, so did interpretation. The same salt that shimmered on a skin began to appear in ritual. Hunters might touch the dried crystals left on their bodies before eating, a silent acknowledgement of labour before nourishment. The wounded might taste the salt in their own blood and believe it carried power, the memory of the fight, the proof of endurance. Sweat mixed with earth became paste, became paint. The line between body and landscape blurred. We often think of symbolism as a product of abstraction, of language, of art. But in truth, it begins here, in sensation, in repetition, in pattern. To the early human mind, meaning was not invented, it was recognized. The salt that preserved meat might also preserve story. The same substance that burned in the wound could heal the hide. Its dual nature, destructive and sustaining, mirrored existence itself. So the salt of the body became metaphor without words. It told a story of persistence that the tongue did not yet know how to tell, and perhaps, even now, when sweat beads along our temples or drips from our fingers, something in us remembers that to glisten in the light is to live, to surrender a little of ourselves so that the cycle can continue. The salt of the body is not a sign of weakness. It is proof of devotion to life, to motion, to the ongoing dialogue between flesh and earth. And from that devotion, something else began to grow. Ritual. What began as the simple act of cooling became, slowly, the foundation of reverence. In the heat of the chase, in the long miles beneath the sun, in the slow rhythm of labour and rest, early humans learned that effort itself carried sacred weight. The body in motion was not only surviving, it was offering. Each drop of sweat that fell to the soil was a silent libation, a gesture of gratitude or plea, depending on the season and the outcome. When the hunt succeeded, sweat and blood mingled in the dust and both were treated with care. The animal's life and the hunter's labour merged in one sacred exchange. In later echoes of this relationship we can still trace that reverence. The sweat lodge, the salt offering, the purifying bath. Each ritual in its way is a dialogue with the same principle, that the body's fluids are bridges between the physical and the spiritual, between effort and essence. It is not difficult to imagine how this understanding began. Under the night fires, when stories took form and voices carried warmth into the dark, people began to connect the patterns of their bodies with those of the world. Rain fell, replenishing the land, and they sweated beneath the sun. Both were cycles of water. Blood ran in their veins as rivers ran through the plains. Salt collected on their skin as salt gathered along the edges of ancient lakes. Everything, it seemed, was mirrored in everything else. The universe was not distant. It pulsed within them. In those moments, the human body ceased to be merely a vessel. It became a cosmos in miniature, reflecting the rhythms of the larger world. This was not science, not yet, but it was a kind of knowing, a recognition that the same forces that shaped the mountains shaped the muscle, that what evaporated from the skin might one day return as rain. Sweat, in that sense, was part of the eternal exchange, a temporary surrender to the endless balance of give and take. As their awareness deepened, humans began to assign meaning to that surrender. Sweat could cleanse the spirit as much as the flesh. To work until the body glistened was to purify, to burn away the heaviness of hunger or grief. Sweat was proof that one had endured. It became a measure of truth, and so, in the glow of the firelight or beneath the glaring sky, people began to see the sacred in themselves. The divine was not something distant, hidden among stars, and it was in the body, in its labour, its rhythm, its exhaustion and renewal. The salt of the body was not shame, but sanctity, a tangible reminder that even in struggle, there is holiness in persistence. In time, this recognition would shape not only how early humans worked, but how they saw themselves. The act of sweating became both physical necessity and symbolic gesture, uniting all forms of exertion under one elemental truth. Nothing living escapes the law of exchange. To give salt was to live was to give salt. Imagine a group returning from the plains, exhausted, dust-caked, glistening. The air hums with heat and fatigue. They have carried back meat or roots, or simply the story of endurance. Around the fire that evening their faces shine with the faint sheen of effort. Someone notices how the skin sparkles when the light hits the salt. Someone else rubs a finger across their forearm, tasting the sting and the mineral tang. What was once invisible becomes seen. What was once instinct becomes symbol. The body tells its own myth. Even before language had the precision to describe holiness, the body understood it. Holiness was what happened when life pressed against its limits and did not break. The salt that dried on the skin was proof that one had come close to exhaustion, and returned, that the body had been tested and found capable. It was, and in every sense, evidence of faith, not in gods yet named, but in the very continuity of being. Salt, too, became memory. In the same way that sweat recorded effort, the mind began to record meaning. The early brain, lit by firelight and fatigue, made connections between sensation and story. A taste of salt recalled the labour that earned it. A crust of white left on the skin recalled the heat of the day, the pulse of movement, the collective work of survival. To remember was to feel again the sting, the relief, the humility of existing in a body that demanded so much and gave so much in return. And as with all things sacred, imitation followed. Sweat was recreated in ritual, in dance, in trial, in ceremony. Perhaps the tribe gathered and moved together beneath the sun until their skin gleamed, the act itself a form of communion. Or perhaps in times of mourning they washed with salt water, returning to the element that tied all living things to the sea. The ritual did not need words. The meaning lived in sensation, heat, salt, breath, rhythm. These gatherings were not performances, they were reaffirmations, moments of alignment between the human and the elemental. Through salt and effort, they remembered that survival was not conquest but participation. The body did not rule the earth, it conversed with it. Sweat was how the earth spoke back. It is easy now to forget this dialogue, to see the body as separate from the world that shapes it. But deep within our blood and our breath, the memory persists that salt is not waste, but witness. A trace of our earliest prayers, offered not in words, but in the shimmer of the living skin. That shimmer, fleeting, luminous, alive, carried within it the entire arc of our becoming. It was the bridge between the animal and the aware, between instinct and insight. To sweat was to exist fully, to take part in the continuous miracle of being alive within a fragile, evaporating moment. For our ancestors, the body was not divided from spirit. The two coexisted, inseparable, written in the same language of salt and breath. From this union of flesh and meaning came ritual, the earliest human art form. Around fires, within caves, or beneath the wide-open sky, people began to enact their relationship with the world. They recreated the struggle for water, the chase beneath the sun, the quenching of thirst. Every drop of effort was holy, every ache a hymn. Their rituals were not designed to ask for favour, but to affirm belonging. Sweat was the offering, not blood, not sacrifice, but the simple proof of movement, of life engaged with itself. As symbolic thought blossomed, salt took on new layers of significance. It became currency and covenant, medicine and curse. To share salt was to share trust. To spill it carelessly was to risk imbalance. These later interpretations, scattered across cultures and centuries, are echoes of that first relationship, when salt was not metaphor but survival, when every crystal was an extension of the body's will to continue. Through this lens, the human story is not one of separation from nature but of constant exchange. Every drop of sweat that falls to the ground returns eventually through cloud and rain, to feed the soil, to enter the roots, to rise again in the veins of another creature. The same salt that crystallizes on our skin drifts in ocean tides and ancient seabeds. In shedding ourselves, we return to what first gave rise to us. The cycle is unbroken, even now. When we work, when we run, when we weep, we are reenacting a dialogue older than memory. The body does not forget its origins. The taste of salt on the tongue, the sting of it on an open wound, the slick trace it leaves on our lips after effort. These are remnants of an inheritance carried quietly through deep time. Beneath language, beneath culture, beneath all invention, the salt of the body remains the same. And so, in the deep quiet of night, or the burning clarity of day, when the skin glistens once more beneath the weight of effort, we are not merely sweating, we are remembering. We are speaking the oldest prayer known to our kind, one without words, offered from the body to the earth, from the earth to the sky. The salt of the body is not a symbol of fatigue. It is the signature of life itself, the earth distilled through flesh, the sea returned through motion, the story of endurance written, again and again, upon the skin. The wind is the oldest sculptor of the living world. It does not build, it refines. It wears down mountains and carries seeds, carving both stone and story, and through millions of years it has shaped us too, polishing the edges of our ancestors until what remained was neither beast nor angel, but something infinitely reflective, infinitely mutable. Under its breath, fur gave way to skin, and the human form became a mirror to the elements that created it. By the time of the second shedding, the planet itself was in motion, glaciers retreating, deserts expanding, forests pulsing with change. The ice that had once bound the north began to melt, releasing long frozen winds that mixed with heat from the southern plains. Climate was no longer static background. It was a teacher, relentless and impartial, and every lesson it taught was written on the body. Evolution does not forget. What had once been gained for warmth could be lost again for speed, for efficiency, for endurance. In this turning of cycles, fur fell away once more. It was not an accident, it was repetition. The Earth was reminding its newest experiment, the bipedal ape, of the truth written into all life. To exist is to change, to adapt is to remember. The wind that cooled the sweat on bare skin was the same force that once tangled through fur in the Miocene canopy. The body, stripped again, was simply another reflection of the climate's desire to continue reshaping itself through flesh. But this time, something more profound accompanied the transformation. The second loss of fur was not only physical, it was symbolic. A mirror held up to the species that could now see itself. To stand naked beneath the sun was to confront one's own vulnerability, to recognize that nature had given no armor but awareness. The body had become open, exposed, radiant, and in that exposure lay the birth of introspection, the shimmering of skin beneath heat, the shiver beneath wind. These sensations became part of identity itself. The human body was no longer only surviving within the world. It was reflecting it, internalizing its flux and turning it into narrative. Just as the desert mirrors the sun and the glacier mirrors the sky, so too did the body begin to mirror the environment that shaped it. In sweat and gooseflesh, in tan and pallor, in the flush of blood and the trembling of chill, it carried the signatures of every climate it had endured. The mirror of the wind was not something external. It was the human form itself, polished through time until it could hold the image of the world around it. We did not merely evolve in nature. We evolved as nature remembering its own reflection. And what happens when the world begins to see itself? Through us. The answer perhaps is written in the body's dialogue with the air. Every breeze across the skin carries both memory and instruction. The warmth of the plains, the chill of highlands, the salt of coastal wind, all these became quiet architects of form. With each climatic fluctuation, the human body responded not with defiance but with reflection. It listened. It adjusted. It learned to survive not through domination but through mimicry, through becoming the landscape it inhabited. Over millions of years, this conversation deepened. Environmental feedback loops, those endless exchanges between climate and physiology, became the silent rhythm of our becoming. When heat intensified, sweat responded. When wind chilled, the blood drew inward, conserving warmth. The skin darkened beneath the equator, lightened beneath clouds. The lungs expanded at altitude. The sinews of the legs lengthened for distance. Nothing was random. Everything was rehearsal. The earth was sculpting itself into mobility, adaptability, reflection. And yet, as this second shedding unfolded, it did something evolution rarely allows. It created a creature that could notice its own transformation. To feel the wind on bare skin is to experience awareness made tactile. The cold sting or the warm caress becomes a dialogue between mind and matter. Our ancestors, newly naked beneath the changing skies, began to understand that they were both subject and mirror of the forces around them. The climate was not a backdrop. It was the pulse of their own being. When a gust swept across the plains, it did not only shape the direction of travel, it shaped thought. The mind, once tethered to immediate survival, began to stretch outward, to imagine cause and consequence. The same curiosity that once led hands to strike flint now followed the invisible trails of air. Where does the wind begin? Why does it shift? What unseen power commands it? Such questions carried the first sparks of philosophy, that the self and the world might not be separate, but different expressions of the same movement, and so the human body, bare, open, responsive, became the living embodiment of balance between vulnerability and intelligence. The shedding of fur was not regression, it was revelation. It allowed the wind to touch us directly, to teach through sensation what could not yet be spoken in words. The chill of dawn, the scorch of noon, the sigh of evening, all became lessons in impermanence and endurance. In those endless exchanges, humanity learned something the canopy had once concealed, that to be exposed is not to be weak, it is to be awake. The mirror of the wind reflected a new understanding, that evolution is not a ladder, but a breathing cycle, an eternal inhalation and exhalation between life and environment. Each adaptation, each loss, each gain was part of a single rhythm, and within that rhythm the naked ape began to see not just the world, but its own face within it. That recognition did not come as a single revelation, but as a series of quiet reflections echoing through generations. It showed itself in the pause before a hunt, when a breeze stirred dust across bare skin and reminded the body of its fragility. It whispered through the ache of thirst beneath an unforgiving sky, where sweat was not just cooling mechanism but sacrifice, salt given to survive. In each of these moments, the human form became less a container of life and more a canvas upon which life was painted anew by each climate, each season, each change. The cyclical nature of adaptation, this grand spiral of loss and return, was not a flaw of evolution, but its signature. The second shedding of fur wasn't simply a reversion to a previous form, but an echo of necessity. As the ice retreated and warmer climates reclaimed the land, the burdens of insulation became obsolete once again. Fur, a gift in the cold, became a weight in the heat. The body, ever honest in its relationship with the land, began to let go, not in haste, but in memory, as if it had done this before, because it had. Evolutionary convergence is often seen in nature. Wings in birds and bats, sleek bodies in dolphins and ichthyosaurs, but rarely is it witnessed within a single lineage, repeating its own design, reshaping itself along familiar lines. In humans, the second loss of fur reveals a profound truth, that biology is not only shaped by need, but by remembered need. Genetic pathways, once forged, never fully disappear. They linger, dormant but available, like notes in a forgotten song waiting for the rhythm to return. And return it did. With each step back into the heat, the human form revisited its own blueprint. The same genes that once silenced hair follicles in the distant past were activated again. The same cooling strategies, sweat production, vascular adaptation, upright posture, reasserted their relevance. Evolution had circled back, not blindly, but with a kind of memory. This is where the mirror deepens. For in these repetitions, in this fluid dance between form and function, the human body was not just adapting, it was becoming aware of adaptation itself. It was learning to recognize the signs of change, to anticipate the needs of tomorrow through the echoes of yesterday. The wind, once just a sensation, became a signal. The sun, once just a warmth, became a measure. The environment was no longer just survived, it was interpreted. And with this capacity, something extraordinary occurred. Not only did humans begin to reflect their world through physiology, but also through culture, through story, through meaning. The body had always mirrored the wind. Now the mind began to mirror time. It was this union of flesh and thought, of environment and awareness, that marked the true emergence of the naked mirror. Not a creature without fur, but a creature capable of seeing itself as part of something vast and cyclical. This vision, quiet as it was, seeped into every layer of existence. It shaped not only bodies, but beliefs. It whispered into the stories told around fires, into the symbols painted on cave walls, into the rhythms of songs passed down along rivers of ancestry. To be human, to be hairless, sun-kissed, wind-brushed, was no longer just an evolutionary identity. It was a state of consciousness, a living memory of climates survived and changes endured. Even in early myth, the environment became metaphor. Heat became a trial. The sun, a judge and giver. Wind, a spirit that moved through life as breath did the body. These were not just poetic instincts, but emergent frameworks for understanding what had already been etched into skin. Without fur to separate them from the sky, our ancestors lived in communion with every element. They did not simply live in the world, they wore it. And what they wore became wisdom. The nakedness of the body, once seen as vulnerable, evolved into a canvas of resilience. Skin became archive, mapping the burns of sun, the roughness of labour, the fine lines of age. It recorded not only physical trial, but emotional terrain. Touch became communication. The cool of evening after sweat, the brush of another's hand. These sensations birthed not only relief, but tenderness. The mirror reflected feeling, and in doing so, began to shape connection. This intimate relationship between physiology and perception explains more than survival. It explains why our ancestors began to wonder. Why they lifted their gaze to the horizon and asked not only what is out there, but what does it mean to be here? The mirror showed them their bodies, yes, but it also showed them time. Through adaptation, they saw how the past shaped the present. Through sensation, they glimpsed how experience shaped understanding. The convergence of climate and cognition opened a doorway to reflection, not just of the self, but of others. In recognizing that they had changed, they could recognize change in each other. Skin tones, body forms, scars, all became markers not of separation, but of shared journey. Each human body bore a map of migration, a history of sun and shadow. To touch another was to feel not only presence, but a story, of wind, of earth, of endurance. This was the subtle, sacred power of the naked mirror. It did not need temples or scrolls, it needed only awareness, that to be alive was to be shaped by the same elements that shaped the mountains, the rivers, the sky. And so, as evolution cycled once more through heat and cold, growth and regression, humanity remained steady, not because it resisted change, but because it had come to understand itself as change. The mirror, polished by wind and time, now returned the gaze. It revealed a truth that fur once obscured, that the human body was not merely a product of biology, but an active participant in a much older dialogue, one between life and the shifting world it occupies. Where once fur shielded us from the environment, the absence of it now pulled us closer to it. There was no longer distance between the self and the season. There was only permeability. And in this intimacy, a deeper form of intelligence emerged, not the kind measured by tools or language, but a quiet sensitivity to cycles. The naked body, stripped of fur and fully exposed to the whims of the world, became an antenna for time. The warmth of spring did not merely bring comfort, it brought the memory of past blooms. The dryness of the air spoke of what was coming. The clouds gathered, and somewhere deep in the bones anticipation stirred. This body, this mirror, could now forecast. Not through prediction, but through attunement. It felt the story of the earth, and in doing so, it became part of the earth's memory. Every adaptation etched into skin, every physiological shift, every subtle inheritance. These were notes in a great evolutionary manuscript that had no beginning, only continuation. And as it continued, it began to spiral back. The shedding of fur had happened before, its return had too. Each event left marks that still shimmer beneath our skin. Ghost patterns, ancient codes, dormant responses waiting in our genes. The mirror of the wind reminded us that nothing in nature is truly linear. Adaptations rise and fall like the tides, echoing past environments, hinting at future ones. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Even today, when we stand beneath a burning sun or shiver in a cold breeze, the mirror remains. It reflects not only weather, but history, not only sensation, but the deep knowledge that we are shaped by forces far beyond our control, and yet not separate from them. To be human is to be in motion, shedding, adapting, returning, transforming. In the silence between heartbeat and breath, the story continues. A story written not in language, but in tissue, not in stone, but in sweat, not in monuments, but in the stillness after running, the ache after work, the warmth of another's skin. The mirror of the wind, polished across millennia, now reflects a simple truth, that we are the climate made conscious, that we are not apart from the world, we are its echo, its pulse, its wondering gaze cast back upon itself. And in that gaze, the journey of the sweating ape becomes something more, not just survival but self-recognition, not just adaptation, but awareness, not just change, but meaning. The breath of the plains is long and wide and patient. It moves not with haste, but with the deep rhythm of continents drifting, of stars gliding across the African night. And there, standing upon the open earth, beneath the weightless dome of a boundless sky, stands a creature like no other, bare, upright, and unafraid. The fur is gone, the claws are dulled, the scent of the wild still clings to the wind, but it is no longer the wind's master that stares into the horizon. It is the one who listens to it, who learns from it, who begins, at last, to see. What does it mean to stand exposed beneath the sun? Not just physically, not just the loss of a covering, but a stripping away of illusion, a confrontation with the rawness of the world. To be naked in the savannah is to be vulnerable in a place that punishes fragility, and yet, paradoxically, it is here, in that very nakedness, that strength emerges. Because with no fur to insulate or hide, the body begins to adapt not only through muscle or speed, but through mind, through cooperation, through vision that stretches beyond instinct and into intention. It is easy to imagine the plains as hostile, but they are not cruel. They are honest. They reveal what is necessary. The sun gives, but it demands. The distance beckons, but it does not forgive. Only those who can endure both, the heat and the emptiness, survive. But survival, in this form, is not the raw endurance of a lone beast. It is the choreography of many, to run together, to track in silence, to share water and salt and pain. In the shimmer of the air and the dust of migration trails, the human form is not carved by claws or armoured skin, but by a deeper principle: trust. Trust that another will watch the ridge while you rest. Trust that the mind beside you remembers the bend in the river. Trust that your sweat, your breath, your exposed body will be matched by another's pace. The skin then becomes more than flesh. It becomes signal, expression, a field upon which emotion writes its code. The flush of effort, the glisten of joy, the tension of fear. These are not hidden beneath fur anymore. They are revealed, shared, offered, and so something ancient dies. The insulation of the solitary predator, the cold barrier of instinct, and something new is born. Exposure as language, visibility as bond. Where once there was only the mechanics of muscle, now there is the nuance of meaning. The body speaks, the body listens, the body learns. It is here that the horizon becomes something more than a boundary. It becomes an invitation. Because when the body no longer fears being seen, it begins to seek. And when it begins to seek, it begins to wonder. What lies beyond that distant ridge, where the clouds gather like old gods and the grass shimmers like memory? It is not just prey. It is not just shelter or shade. It is the unknown, and with it, the spark of something truly unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, the desire to understand. The plains do not promise safety, but they offer space, vast and unforgiving, for thought to unfold. And it is in that space, under the breathless canopy of sky, that awareness begins to take shape, a kind of awareness that reflects not just what is seen, but what might be. The naked skin, once merely a surface for sweat and sun, becomes a canvas of imagination. With every footfall across cracked earth, with every shared glance across the embers of a fire, the mind within that skin begins to stretch. Language stirs, not in full sentences, not yet, but in rhythm and gesture, in mimic and murmur. The exposed face becomes a mirror for emotion, a place where the storm inside can show itself. Vulnerability invites response. Exposure teaches empathy. This is where intelligence deepens, not in isolation, but in communion. What began as biology now becomes behaviour. Groups form bonds not just of kinship, but of memory. The hunt is remembered, the watering hole mapped in thought. Knowledge is passed, not merely instinctively, but through the slow sedimentation of shared experience. The child watches the elder's hand trace a line in the dirt. Meaning is made in dust and skin, and still the sun presses on. Still the wind cuts through the open world. Evolution has not paused, it never does. But now adaptation is not only written in bone or blood, it is written in culture, in story, in choice. The nakedness of our ancestors did not strip them down to weakness, it revealed the mechanisms by which cooperation could become the new armour. Nakedness became strategy. It allowed the body to regulate heat, yes, but it also allowed the soul, if we dare to call it that, to breathe. The second loss of fur was not a regression, it was a culmination, a lesson learned and relearned, across ice and savanna through trial and survival. It told us something profound, that life does not always favour the most armoured. Sometimes it favours the most open, the most attuned, the most capable of change. Skin that once bore the marks of concealment now bore the signs of belonging, to a group, to a land, to a story that would stretch beyond sight. Beneath that great sky, hairless and shining with effort, the human being became not just an animal but a question, a mirror held up to nature, fragile and enduring, finite and reaching. With each breath taken across those golden plains, something new was drawn in, not just air, but awareness, not just scent, but story. And the story begins to ask, what are we, now that we are no longer hidden, now that we carry no pelt but thought itself? The answer, perhaps, was already in the way the group moved, together not just out of instinct but intention. Vulnerability had reshaped behaviour. Where once fur insulated and isolated, the bare body required interdependence. A wound needed tending, a chill needed fire, a child needed arms. Nakedness became not only a state of being, but a call for care, and in that care a new kind of intelligence was born. Social intelligence, the mind of the group, found not in genes, but in gestures. Over time, this communal sensitivity wove itself into every layer of life. The naked body, open to injury and disease, became also the body that learned to protect, to nurture, to heal. Hands once used for climbing began to grind roots, cradle infants, and paint symbols on cave walls. Eyes, exposed and expressive, read more than danger. They read each other. Joy, sorrow, warning, trust. The skin, through its very fragility, invited connection. And connection, in the long view of evolution, is power. In the sweltering sun one could sweat, but in the cool dark one must huddle. In the drought one must share. The bare skin made solitude costly, and so we invented togetherness. We learned to lean on memory, who found water last season, who gave food when the hunt failed. Gratitude, perhaps, was one of our earliest tools, not a word but a weight, a balance held in the mind between bodies. From these early exchanges of food, of fire, of favour, emerged the scaffolding of what we now call civilization. But in its nascent form, it was simply the negotiation of survival through empathy, one gesture at a time, and all of it remarkably shaped not by strength or weaponry but by weakness. The same skin that blistered, bled, and burned also forged bonds resilient enough to span generations. This interplay, between exposure and invention, would define us. The plains offered no shelter, so we created shade. The sun offered no mercy, so we wove coverings. But even clothed, we remembered what it meant to be bare. That memory lived in ritual, in the smearing of ochre on the skin, in the pressing of hands against stone, in the stories passed from one body to another by firelight. We began to mark time not just in seasons, but in symbols. The thinking skin did not forget the touch of wind or ash. And so, somewhere in this unfolding, perhaps in the long breath before dawn or in the hush that follows the death of an elder, we began to understand that our bodies were not obstacles to thought, but instruments of it. Every bead of sweat, every salt trace on skin, every scar, these were not imperfections but inscriptions, records of effort, of endurance, of experience. We did not need fur to remember. We had each other, and the skin itself had become memory. On the open plains, memory was not abstract. It was held in the body, in movement, in ritual. Each step across sun-baked earth retraced a path taken before. Each gesture echoed 1,000 before it. In this continuity of motion and meaning, the human animal became something new, a creature not only shaped by time, but aware of it. And it was this awareness, born in sweat, pain, and presence, that gave rise to our earliest forms of reflection. Nakedness no longer meant exposure alone. It came to mean honesty. To stand unclothed before another was to be seen fully, unhidden, unarmed. Perhaps it was in this transparency that trust was first cultivated. Not in the sharp edge of dominance, but in the soft openness of vulnerability. To be seen and not struck. To be heard and not chased. These quiet exchanges, repeated over countless evenings and migrations, shaped the contours of the early human society more powerfully than tooth or claw ever could. The thinking skin learned to blush, to tingle at contact, to shiver not just from cold, but from story, from meaning. Words had not yet formed, but the body was already fluent in the language of feeling. Joy radiated, grief sank, anticipation pulsed at the surface, and all of it was read, responded to, remembered. The skin did not just sense, it participated. As groups grew, this embodied language allowed for more than survival. It allowed for identity. Individuals could be known not just by scent or sound, but by the ways they moved, reacted, gave, and grieved. Personality began to matter. Emotion became part of memory. And memory, that most fragile and persistent of human faculties, began to tie the present to a past, and that past to a future. In this way, bare skin was not just the end of fur, it was the beginning of continuity, for self across time. But memory was not merely biological, it was cultural. The skin, exposed and expressive, became a canvas upon which early humans painted meaning. Ash, ochre, blood, clay. All were applied not only for decoration, but for declaration. To belong, to mourn, to warn, to become something other than what the earth alone had made. Through these marks, humans told the world, I am not only of this place, I am also of my people. This was perhaps the deepest transformation of all, not fire, nor tool, nor language, but the shift from being shaped by nature to shaping it in return. From being seen to choosing how to be seen. The furred creature of the Miocene canopy had vanished. In its place stood something else, a figure sculpted by climate, time, and touch, but now aware of its own outline. And beneath the wide horizon, in the hush between breath and wind, this figure lifted its head and felt something new. Not just life, but presence. Not just endurance, but meaning. In the breath of the plains, a new kind of silence emerged. Not the hush of fear, nor the quiet of waiting prey, but a contemplative stillness. It was the silence of awareness, the pause before a thought takes shape, the openness of a mind no longer shackled to reaction alone. And in that silence, something awakened that no animal had known before, the ability to wonder. Why was the sun so warm? Why did the stars return each night? Why did pain linger long after the wound had closed? These questions did not require answers to change us. They only required asking. And it was through this capacity to ask, to dwell in the unknown, that early humans began the long journey toward consciousness. Fur had kept us warm, but it had also kept us hidden. Now bare to the sky, the human form could be seen not just by others, but by itself. Water reflected not only face, but gaze. Shadows cast upon cave walls became outlines of being. We no longer simply existed in the world, we observed our place within it. This shift was neither instant nor complete, but it marked the beginning of a recursive loop that would define us. To sense ourselves sensing, to feel ourselves feeling. The thinking skin, exposed, reactive, interpretive, became both boundary and bridge. It separated us from the world and connected us to it. It bore the heat of the day, the chill of the night, the hands of others, the marks of time, and it told us in every touch and tremble that we were alive. that we were more than muscle and instinct, that the body could be a site of story, and that story could be a form of truth. We returned to the plains not as the same creatures who had left the forest. We had become readers of each other, archivists of experience, narrators of motion. And though we had shed fur, we had gained something far more enduring: culture, memory, presence. The breath of the plains still lives in us, in our heat, in our skin, in our endurance. We walk with it every day, unknowingly carrying the legacy of those first barefooted migrations across the sunlit savannah. Every bead of sweat, every scar, every goosebump is a whisper from that age, a signature of the long experiment that made us who we are. We are not just survivors of change, we are its expression. The fur is gone, the body endures, the mind reflects. And beneath the skin, this final inheritance of adaptation and awareness, humanity breathes. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long arc of transformation, for following the shedding of fur, the blooming of skin, and the breath that made us human. If this story helped you feel a sense of quiet wonder, offered a new way to see your own reflection, or simply kept you company for a while, thank you for being here. I wonder, what part of this journey will stay with you? Was there a moment where the silence felt familiar, or a single phrase that curled softly around your thoughts? Whether it was the shimmering outline of a body running beneath the sun, the flicker of firelight across bare skin, or the whisper of ancient winds through an open plain, these fragments are what connect us, a constellation of memory across time. If a thought lingered with you, I'd love to read about it below, even a sentence, even a word. These are the quiet offerings that shape this listening space into something shared. And if you'd like to join us again for more deep time journeys, strange ancestors, or stories buried in the marrow, subscribing gently supports this work and makes the next chapter possible. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,